Well, good morning and welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming here to our training for the Eviction Representation Project. Want to also start out with a big thank you to Frederickson and Byron for hosting us today and providing us breakfast as we go through our training today. My name is Mariah Kruger. I'm the Housing Program Manager and Resource Attorney at Volunteer Lawyers Network. And we are pleased here today to be providing this training on the Eviction Representation Project. Intuitively, we know that having a lawyer representing you in court makes a difference. Recently, Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid and Volunteer Lawyers Network underwent a study to quantify that difference. We found that when someone is represented by a lawyer in the eviction setting, they are 4 to 5 times less likely to receive the worst result in the eviction setting, which is the forcible removal from their home by a landlord. We also know that when a tenant is represented by an attorney in the eviction setting, they are significantly more likely to win or settle their cases, and the terms of those settlement agreements are significantly better. We also know that the vast majority of tenants still proceed through an eviction without an attorney. This is where we are stepping in. Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid started an eviction representation program a little bit over a year ago. The program is set up so that attorneys are available to represent clients as they walk into the courthouse for the initial appearance in their eviction case that day. We call this the ERP program, the Eviction Representation Project. And while the ERP program has been very successful so far, we've only begun to scratch the surface of the need for eviction representation. We as a society have decided that the right to liberty is so important that we will provide people a lawyer in the criminal setting. However, we have not yet decided as a society that the right to housing is equally as important. But we do know that the lack of stable housing is the underpinning for so many other social illnesses. Without stable homes, children can't attend school regularly, and they can't focus on their schoolwork. Without stable homes, people miss work and can't make their doctor's appointments. Without stable housing, neighborhoods become transient, less connected, and less safe. This program, the ERP program, is meant to be a stopgap until we as a society declare and fully fund a right to counsel and housing. So thank you, many of you already, for signing up for the More Representation Minneapolis through your firms. Through this initiative, your firm has agreed to take on shifts at the housing court during these initial appearance calendars. We know that your work representing tenants in this setting makes a difference. This training today is meant to enable VLN volunteers to take these full representation ERP shifts. We have 2 trainers here for our training today. The first is Steve Swanson. Steve is going to talk for the first 15 to 20 minutes about the nuts and bolts of the ERP project. Steve was an attorney with Legal Aid for over 17 years, spent 20 years as a Hennepin County District Court judge and a senior judge, and 3 years as a part-time administrative law judge. He is currently a project attorney with VLN. Our second trainer today is Larry McDonough. Larry will spend the rest of our time today on the nuts and bolts of eviction law. Larry also has spent over 30 years at Legal Aid, working primarily in housing law. Larry is a national expert on landlord and tenant law litigation. He is taught at all of the Minnesota law schools and has had a hand in drafting many of the housing statutes and rules here in Minnesota. Larry keeps us all up to date with landlord-tenant law through his online manual, the Residential Eviction Defense Manual. One more note before I hand it over to Steve so that we can begin our training today. For those of you who are interested in taking up an ERP shift and will not be doing it through your law firm, please see me either during the break or at the end of the training today. We are currently scheduling shifts for Monday and Wednesday afternoons. And if you're interested in taking one of those, we have several shifts available at this time. I also want to make a plea. I had a case come through my office last night. I have someone who has a trial in an eviction case this coming Friday at 1:15 in front of Judge Labine, and I'm looking for an attorney who would be willing to take those folks on full rep. This training would be excellent training for that also. So please see me if you might be interested in that case. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Steve to begin our training.
Thank you very much, Mariah, and let me extend a personal welcome to all of you this morning. It's a pleasure to see you. I'm very gratified by the turnout this morning and by the response to Mayor Fry's initiative by the law firms in this town that have stepped up and said, we're going to participate, as Mariah said, in this idea of providing full representation to tenants in unlawful detainer court, or as it's now called, eviction court. I'm very pleased also that Larry McDonough is on the program this morning. Larry and I have known each other for a long time. He is the leading expert in the state of Minnesota on landlord-tenant law. So we're very lucky this morning to have him come and talk to you about defenses to eviction action, which is the key part of the work of a lawyer in eviction court, is understanding and being able to identify defenses. I don't have a PowerPoint this morning. I'm not going to talk for that long. I do have a written presentation, which is part of the handouts. So I'd ask you to look at that at your leisure. It's about 4 pages, has some useful information, so please take a time when you get back to your office to take a look at it. There are also several handouts on the table this morning, so please make sure and pick all those up and take a look at them. One is what we are calling the VLN Eviction Representation Project Packet. And that packet contains a defense checklist, a settlement agreement that's been prepared by Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, VLN retainers form, the affidavit for proceeding informer papyrus, and the Rule 105 notice of withdrawal. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Other handouts at the table are Larry answer, which is incredible in itself and is a piece of training material, because when you look at that answer, it's totally annotated with the law, the cases, every defense that's possible in a private eviction action. Also on the table is the IFP affidavit, the same affidavit that the court uses, but with Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid's checklist for additional expenses if the person is close to the border on qualifying for IFP status. And lastly at the table is the settlement agreement that is used by the court and is available at the court and is used by many landlords. Larry will talk about the difference between that settlement agreement and the settlement agreement in our eviction packet, which has been prepared by Legal Aid. I don't have a slideshow. I do have some props. This is a hammer. This is a nail. This is a writ of recovery. And this is the sheriff's badge. And why do I have these props? Because, as you probably all know, if the tenant loses in an eviction action, what happens is the landlord purchases a writ of recovery from the court, takes it to the sheriff's office. The sheriff takes that writ, comes out, nails it up on the tenant's door, gives the tenant 24 hours to move. If the tenant does not move, the sheriff comes back, throws the tenant, her children, her dog, her cat, and all of her property out of the apartment. And that's what an eviction action is all about. And as you can imagine, for tenants faced with evictions, they're under an enormous amount of stress. They often don't understand the proceeding. They don't know really what's happening in court. They're completely overwhelmed with financial stress, and they don't know what's going to happen to their family. So that's where you all come in. And that's why this eviction representation project is so important, because tenants need someone to stand between them, the landlord, and the sheriff at court. And that's what we will do. Mariah talked about the study that's been done. There's a link to it in my written presentation. You can read it online. It's very interesting, but certainly what it does is it confirms all our intuitive and instinctual understanding that tenants with lawyers do much better in court than tenants without lawyers. Let me give you, just so that you understand the unlawful detainer or the eviction process, a brief historical context. It comes from territorial days in Minnesota when the legislature abolished self-help evictions, and in place of self-help evictions, created court-supervised evictions, which is the eviction statute, Chapter 504B of the Minnesota statutes. It did this to create for property owners at that time a very summary process to evict tenants who were not paying the rent, who had violated the terms of a lease, or who had held over after the lease period had expired. Now, we're talking about the 19th century. But the process, although there have been many additions to the statute over time, some of them very beneficial, the process is basically the same. It's basically the same that it was then. And in fact, until 1973, in Minnesota, a tenant who lost in an unlawful detainer or an eviction proceeding was found guilty. The word guilty remained in the statute until 1973. That's because at the beginning, evictions were handled by justices of the peace, just like misdemeanor offenses, and later by municipal court and county court judges. So basically, the court system has viewed the eviction process as quasi-criminal. When I started at Legal Aid in 1971, one of the municipal court judges, if I recall correctly, at the first appearance calendar, the first question for every tenant would be, do you plead guilty or not guilty? And that culture, although it's changed over time, that culture of having an easy summary proceeding for the property owner, for the landlord, is still in place. There are two important results from an eviction action. The first, and obviously the most difficult for the tenant, is being evicted forcibly or having to move before the sheriff comes back out to move the tenant out. But the second problem is that when the unlawful detainer or the eviction action is filed, it goes on the tenant's record. And the screening services that provide screening reports on prospective tenants to landlords pick up those unlawful detainer cases no matter what happened to the case. And in such a tight rental housing market as we have now, it's very difficult for tenants that have unlawful detainer or eviction actions on their record to be accepted by landlords, because landlords can be quite choosy. So it's absolutely essential as part of this process of representing tenants that the eviction action be expunged. That is, that the court seals the record so it is not available to the screening services. And the screening services are then notified by the tenant's attorney that that unlawful detainer is no longer part of the public record. And Larry's going to talk about expungement during his presentation. I've been now, since I started with VLN a few months ago, I've been to housing court several times. When I was a district court judge, referees did housing court. Judges only saw cases very rarely. So I did not have a lot of experience, even though I was in the building, of seeing what happened in housing court. I have that experience now. It is an incredible place. How many of you have been to the third floor of the Government Center to housing court? Okay, so many of you have, some of you haven't. It's an incredibly exciting, I would put it that way, incredibly exciting environment. There is a lot going on. Everything's going on, people standing, sitting on benches. There's very little space to have a private conversation. Much of it is chaotic, but it's also extremely exciting. So it's going to be exciting for me as being over there to work with you all at this project to see tenants walking into the courtroom with an attorney. Because now most tenants walk into the courtroom without an attorney, but there's the landlord's attorney sitting at the table with a stack of files. And the impression that it gives me and it gives every tenant is that the landlord's attorney and the referee are working hand in hand to get through this calendar. And that's a very discouraging idea. The more attorneys that walk into court with the tenant, the less that atmosphere will continue, and the less housing court will be viewed that way by everybody sitting inside the courtroom. So it's very gratifying to me that you all have stepped forward to do this. Let me tell you a little bit about the calendars that you'll be seeing. It's called the Initial Appearance Calendar. It's held by the court Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoon at 1:15. If there are holidays, there may be an occasional Tuesday or Thursday calendar. Basically, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 1:15. There's up to 45 cases on the calendar, and there often are close to 45 cases on the calendar. What happens is everybody gathers out in the hall. The courtroom is locked. At 1:15, the clerk opens the courtroom door, asks everybody to come in, and the referee comes out, gives a short presentation about what's going to happen, and then the clerk calls every case to find out who's present and who isn't present. And the clerk has organized the calendar in a way that the clerk is calling all the cases from a particular landlord at the same time. The referee tells everybody, including the landlord attorney or the landlords themselves, and they're not always represented, tells everybody that I order you, when I'm done and the clerk is done calling the calendar, to go out into the hall and try to settle the case. It's a standing order of the referees. And that's what happens. Everybody leaves the courtroom. Those tenants that are fortunate enough to have attorneys, their attorney talks to the landlord and the landlord's attorney. They try to settle the case. Most cases are settled. And we'll talk a little bit about settlement agreements in a minute. Most cases are settled. The cases that aren't settled, the referee wants to determine if there is a fact question that warrants a trial. Under the general rules of practice, starting I think at 600, which are the housing court rules, which you'll have to become familiar with, that's the process. You get a trial later, within 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 days, if there is a fact question. It's logical. But very few cases are set for trial. Hopefully, with tenants being represented, more and more and more cases will be set for trial. Because trials are very important, because the ultimate goal is to win the case, because that leads to an automatic expungement of the file if you request it of the referee. Settlement agreements are more complicated because that doesn't end the case. And Larry will talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So the way our project is going to work is that you won't have met your client before you come to court at 1:45 or 1 o'clock. But tenants will have been arriving since 12:30. VLN has a coordinator, a person there whose role will be to ask tenants if they want to see a lawyer. And if they say yes, then the coordinator will have them fill out what's called a confidential data sheet, which will have information, contact information for the tenant and some additional information. The coordinator will then determine, both for VLN attorneys and for legal aid's full representative attorneys who are also there, whether the person is financially eligible for our services. Most tenants are, because most tenants are low income and most tenants are in court because they haven't been able to pay their rent. So once that decision is made, then the coordinator, and I'll be working with the coordinator, will come to you with a case. You won't have met the tenant before that moment. So Rule 6.05 of the Rules of Professional Conduct come into play. Rule 6.5, and I talk about it in my written materials, Rule 6.5 allows attorneys in pro bono clinic settings to represent the people that the clients that they see, either for advice or for brief service, without doing a full conflicts check that otherwise would be required under the rules of professional conduct. Because you won't know when you meet the tenant for the first time whether your service is going to end that day or whether your service is going to continue. You have to do a conflicts check, because if your service continues, you'll sign a retainer form, you'll be not covered by Rule 6.5. You'll just be under the general rules of professional conduct. So, and VLN cannot do the conflicts check for you. So that's something that you're going to have to do on your own before you talk to the tenant. Because we don't want a situation where you go through the whole process of interviewing the tenant and then find out later that you can't keep the case. So everyone in their own firms are going to have to decide how to do this. The calendar is available on the court's website the day before the actual call in the calendar. Some law firms run the whole calendar in advance for conflict checks. So that's a possibility, but I have to leave that up to all of you to figure out how you're going to do that. Settlement agreements are the way that most cases are resolved, and that's done on the day. You have two settlement agreement forms here in your information, and the packet is the one that legal aid has prepared. The other one that's on the table is the court form. The legal aid form is better, because the legal aid form allows the tenant, if the tenant complies with the settlement agreement, which is typically a repayment of rent schedule, then the tenant can file an affidavit of compliance and ask the court to administratively expunge the case at that point. The settlement agreement is approved by the referee in open court. They're typically always approved. They're pretty straightforward. The settlement agreement then becomes attached to the findings of fact, conclusions of law, and order of the court, which you will receive and the tenant receives right there at the counter. The same, just they do it right in the courtroom. It's printed, it's distributed right away. So you'll have that. The important thing about that is judgment is not entered. And that's critical, because unless the landlord files an affidavit saying that the tenant has not complied, the landlord cannot get the writ of recovery, and the eviction process cannot go forward. It's very important in those settlement agreements that you have the agreement of the landlord to allow for the administrative expungement of the record upon compliance with the agreement. That's critical. If you can't get that, second best is a box that gets checked that says the landlord does not oppose expungement. So bargaining is going to be the name of the game, at least in most cases. Now, there are some cases you're going to know right away, like one I had yesterday with an attorney from Stinson. You knew right away it was going to go to trial. It was not a non-payment case. It was a breach of lease case. It was going to go to trial, and that's basically what happened. Many cases will be resolved that day and resolved through a settlement agreement. To negotiate a beneficial settlement agreement, you've got to have a defense. Otherwise, the landlord's attorneys have no reason to negotiate. They just hand you a piece of paper and say, take it or leave it. That's why the program this morning, to talk about the defenses and to be able to recognize the defenses during an interview and reading the court documents, which will be given to you by our coordinator at the time you talk to the tenant, is critical. Having a defense, being able to have some leverage in the negotiations. We're going to be asking VLN volunteer attorneys, if they negotiate a settlement agreement with the landlord, to keep the case after the settlement agreement is approved, to follow up with the tenant to make sure that the tenant complies with the agreement, to file the affidavit of compliance, to make sure that the case is administratively expunged, and then to send letters to the services, the screening services, pointing out that it's no longer part of the public record. We're going to be asking you to do that. That means there's going to be retainer agreements. You can use VLN's retainers agreement. We'd ask you to do that. You're going to go away. The tenant's going to go home, and you're going to follow up. That's the idea. That's our hope. That's asking a lot. I realize that. But it's such an important part of the process. Also, it implicates Rule 105 of the General Rules of Conduct, or the General Rules of Procedure. 105 is the withdrawal rule. There's an obligation if any pleading has been filed, and there will be a pleading filed because it'll be the landlord's summons and complaint. If any pleading is filed, then if you make an appearance in court on behalf of the tenant, that's taken down in court, everything's recorded, you have to withdraw. You have to file a Rule 105 withdrawal. If there have been no filings on behalf of the tenant, that's going to cost an awful lot of money unless the tenant qualifies for IFP status. So at some point, you're going to want your client to fill out an IFP form, which is part of the VLN packet. Because at some point, you're going to have to file the Rule 105 notice, and you're going to need permission to do it without paying the fee. Before I turn the program over to Larry, does anyone have a question pertinent to what I've said? We're going to allow time for questions at the end. Does anybody have any questions right now for me? Yes.
So can you walk me through that conflict check process?
Yes.
You said it didn't apply, but then it seemed like it did.
Yeah, it's a little confusing, and it was confusing for me as well. The question is about this 6.5 conflicts check. Under 6.5 of the Rules of Professional Conduct, if you're in a clinic, like you volunteered for our clinic at the housing court, where you sit there, you talk to a tenant, you give the tenant advice, you may have helped the tenant fill out a form, that's a pro bono legal clinic where you don't, if you know of a conflict, you obviously can't represent the tenant, but you don't have to do the full conflicts check that you would do under the Rules of Professional Conduct anytime you represent somebody. Or you're obligated, let me put it this way, you're obligated not to represent someone where there's a conflict or your firm has a conflict. So firms do conflict checks. Because you're not going to know whether you're going to keep the case after talking to the tenant. You need to do the conflicts check before you talk to the tenant. And some attorneys call their offices on the telephone once they get the names of the landlord and the tenant, and they call, and someone runs the conflict check, calls them back, it's okay. Does that answer your question?
So that's just for kind of your walk-in clinic that you wouldn't need to do that check for, but for the initial appearance calendar, and then if you took that client for the subsequent proceedings, then
Yes.
you could do it.
Yes, and yes, the point made is if you're over there as a lawyer in our clinic or legal aid clinic, it'd be our clinic at the courthouse on the third floor where you're only giving advice or limited service, then you're covered by Rule 6.5. But in this project, where we're looking for people to give full representation, you won't be covered by Rule 6.5.
And in the firms that you've worked with in the past, do they, when they run like the whole calendar worth of people and they say, okay, we can represent half of the people that are going to be on this calendar and we can't represent the other half because of a conflict? Is
Yeah.
that ever addressed?
Well, the question is what actually happens when someone runs the check. What happened yesterday, Stinson had run the entire calendar, and I think there were only 2 cases out of 45 or something like that. I don't know for sure whether there was a potential conflict. So conflicts, unless your firm represents landlords, the conflicts are probably not going to occur very often, but they have to be checked. Yes?
Well, I was going to say, even for the walk-in clinic, whenever, as you know, every Monday, Vagary, we staff the clinic, and we have one of our legal assistants come with us, and we run conflicts checks even on the walk-in clinic clients.
Okay. So the point being that some firms are doing conflict checks even just for the pro bono advice clinic. Let me end the program before I turn it over to Larry with a brief skit, because I have the props, all right? So I need Larry, Mariah,
Can I bring my own prop?
yes, you may. And we have to get this on the camera. So, Mariah, you're the sheriff.
Just in case there's any violence, I think
All
I'll
right.
leave my.
Larry, you're the landlord.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe we need to be on this side, on the camera. I don't know.
Okay.
You're on this side?
All right.
And I need one volunteer. Anybody, just come up. There's no speaking parts here. It's risk-free, but I need one volunteer. Thank you. And what's your name?
Beth.
Beth. Beth, if you would stand here and this way.
This way?
No,
This way?
you're okay. I'm the tenant. Beth is standing where you're all going to be standing, between the tenant, the landlord, and the sheriff. And I can't think of a more worthwhile or exciting place to be. So again, thank you, Beth. Thank you. And thank you for your attention this morning. I'll take the props with me and turn the program over to Larry.
Thanks. I was nervous about being in that skit. I guess it was not as bad as I thought. So my name's Larry McDonough. I'm at Pro Bono Counsel at Dorsey and Whitney. I've been there for about 5.5 years before that, and legal services programs for about 30 years. I want to, right now, you've got my contact information on here, but I also want to give you my cell phone number. And so here it is. I'll say it a couple times. It's 651-398-8053. So 651-398-8053. I give that out to you because I am a resource for you all. If you are down at court and you have a question, there are a lot of resources at court, and we'll talk about those. But if you need to talk to someone and bounce something and you don't have anyone else available, give me a call. I can usually step out of meetings, or, you know, anytime I won't be able to answer it is if I'm in court myself. But otherwise, I can help. I'm also pretty responsive to email and calling me at the office as well. This is fun stuff. You might be thinking it's not fun because there's stress involved, but it is fun because you're helping people navigate that. You might be thinking there's a lot to learn. Well, there's some to learn, but you don't have to be kind of like an encyclopedic geek like me to do a case, because I can be a resource for every different type of eviction case. You only have to know that eviction case, okay? And so while there's a lot of materials, I have a 600-page manual that you should not read unless you have serious sleep issues. You don't need to know all that to do a non-payment of rent case with habitability issues, okay? And so part of what we'll talk about today is how to figure out where to kind of focus your efforts when you're doing this. A lot of people that don't do this practice think that it's simple, because in law school, if you discussed evictions and landlord-tenant issues at all, it was probably pretty short. In my curriculum, we covered it in real property law, which was a one-year sequence, and we spent, I think, half of a session in that sequence on landlord-tenant law. So it is complicated, but it is interesting. When I started in legal aid in 1983, I was in a rural office, did a general practice, and when I was looking to move to a metropolitan area, I was applying for a housing position, and I was thinking, well, you know, I guess I could do that for a couple of years, because they wanted a 2-year commitment, okay? So now, 33 years later, still doing it. Why? Because it's intellectually stimulating and it's fun, okay? Part of the fun in this is that you have the opportunity when you go to court or even at the advice clinic, you have the opportunity to make someone's life better or less worse right now. And in most of our practices that aren't involving daily emergencies, that isn't how our practices work. If you're a mergers and acquisition attorney, you're a trademark attorney, you're doing employment policies for employers, what you do today in advancing those efforts, while important, are probably not making someone's life a little better or a little less worse today. And that's what's really fun about this. When you do this work, people think that you have dropped out of heaven into their laps. They really do. And they're very appreciative. Now, they're very stressed, and sometimes that appreciation, you know, follows different forms. But for the most part, people aren't expecting suits to help them. They're expecting suits to hurt them, okay? And we have that opportunity to kind of help them and change that perception and, again, help people's lives. So I think you'll find that this is fun. I think you'll find that it is stressful. But the reason we do this training and the reason we have all the resources we have out there is to make it less stressful. And if you're thinking you're worried about screwing it up, okay, you're worried about not knowing everything, okay, that's actually good. I've probably done 250 trials in my career. I'm nervous for every one. And I think if you don't get nervous in your practice, you should stop your practice and do something else, because you need a certain level of nervousness to be on the top of your game. But the other thing is, regardless of how nervous you are, think about the clients. The chances of you making things worse are probably 0, right? And let's say you miss something, right? Chances of that being a critical miss, again, is really, really low. Chance that the tenant would have missed it, really, really high. And so when you're doing this practice, because it moves fast, if you have kind of a perfectionist side, which is a good thing, you have to let go of it a little bit, okay? Because you know, it's real common in my practice. I've been doing this a long time. If I'm down at housing court and I'm doing an interview with someone and they've got a court hearing coming up, I don't have unlimited time to figure this out, right? And so we have checklists, we have answer forms and things like that to help you digest that. But, you know, if I'm spending 15 or 20 minutes analyzing a case with someone, I'm certainly gonna, the chances of me missing something where you know, if I compared that to when I had a couple hours and then a few days to think about it, right? Chances are probably decent I'm gonna miss something. But still, I'm gonna find things that the tenant's not gonna find. And again, the chances of the misses being critical misses, I think, are really low. So if you have some nervousness about this, that's good. If it's the paralyzing kind of nervousness, let's talk about it, because I think we can get you through that. And I think once you do some of this, you'll find that you are a lot better at it than you thought, okay? In my other life, I'm a jazz pianist, and my wife's a classical flute player, and she's been starting to play some jazz, and she always thinks that she sounds terrible at jazz, and she doesn't. But, you know, she's bringing kind of a perfectionist side to her work, and I'm classically trained as well, so I get that. Part of what she's had to do is let go of that a little bit, because when you're playing jazz, you're making up music in the moment. It can't be perfect. Matter of fact, if it were perfect, it wouldn't be jazz. And so she's learned to let go of that a little bit, but that was a little bit of a struggle. And every time she does it, she thinks, oh, that wasn't very good, right? Even though people are coming up and going, saying, that was stellar, right? And so part of that is the perceptions we put on ourselves, because we want to present a certain way. And if we don't present that way, we're thinking we didn't do all that well. But everybody else is out there looking and going, wow, that person really knows their stuff. Okay, so sorry to spend so much time on this, but I think it's important when you're engaging in an area that's relatively new and it's not something you're going to do on a regular basis to kind of deal with the real natural kind of fears and apprehensions that we have about doing this stuff. Okay, so some of the topics we're going to cover today, it's kind of a long list here, and you know, if you're an old person like me and you're sitting in the back of the room and you have trouble seeing the screen, we do have the handout here, so you can look at that. I'm not going to like point at people that are paging through and go, you couldn't see the screen, so don't worry about that. So this is kind of the outline for the day, and if I get through it fast enough, I will in fact tell you at the bottom who my favorite jazz pianist is. I know you're really waiting for that, and so that's kind of the anticipation that'll kind of keep you alert, engaged while we go through the rest of the stuff. Okay. There's a lot of stuff out there to help you. Okay. I've got a website. It's called povertylaw.homestead.com. It's in your materials. Pretty much everything that we're doing today in terms of court forms, you're going to find there. I've got a manual that you can use, and I'll talk a little bit about how to use that manual in relation to other things that we have. I've got forms for eviction answers, for motions to reopen cases, motions to expunge cases, doing appeals, doing requests for judge review of referee decisions, all that kind of stuff. So what I first want to do is start to analyze eviction cases. And one of the things I want to say before I just get into the weeds on this is that it's pretty rare that I see an eviction case without a defense. And you might be thinking, how could that possibly be? How could that many landlords be screwing through? Okay. Well, the reason is that a lot of landlords are pro se. A lot of attorneys that represent landlords don't do it regularly. Some do. Okay? So you have a less kind of legally sophisticated group on both sides. Even when there are attorneys there, they're sophisticated in their practice, but they're maybe not sophisticated in landlord-tenant law. So there are a lot of things that where folks ought to be a little more attentive, and they're not. Now, certainly when you have pro se landlords, they might, and I've been a landlord off and on in my life, they might be really good at fixing the plumbing. They didn't audit civil procedure in law school, right? And they haven't read 504B, right? So there are good folks that are making mistakes, but there's also a slumlord community out there. And if you think that because we live in this Minnesota Nice area. And for any of you that think that Minnesota Nice actually is a complimentary term, it actually originally was not a complimentary term. It was actually that we act like we're nice, but we're really not that nice. Okay, so that's really the origin of the term. So now of course, because we want to think that we're all nice, we've now twisted the term around and that we're all so nice, okay? There's a slumlord community here, just like there is pretty much everywhere. My first practice area was in a town of 7,500, and we had slumlords there, right? So they're out there. They intentionally kind of navigate the process to their benefit, kind of regardless of what the law is. So with all that said, it's pretty rare that you're going to see a case that lacks a defense. Now, it happens now and then, but I'd say every time I'm down at housing court in the advice clinic, I never go through a shift without finding a case with a defense. Okay? So the first thing we start to look at is personal jurisdiction. And for those of you that are litigators, you maybe don't think about it that much because in commercial practices, you have lawyers on both sides, they're going to get it right. Right? But when you're a defense attorney in any kind of practice, civil practice, one of the first things you ought to be doing is figuring out if the court actually has jurisdiction over your case. The reason why it's more of an issue here is that it gets done incorrectly more often because you have either pro se landlords or you have people doing service that have not gotten into the weeds of the service statute. Okay. So what I have up here is a service statute. There are three main ways to do service. Any of those types of service have to be accomplished at least 7 calendar days before the court hearing, not to the minute, and it is 7 calendar days, not just business days. So if there is a first appearance on a Friday, the court papers, the service has to be complete the Friday before. Now that could happen any time in the day that Friday, okay, but the Friday before. Okay. Personal service, not that hard. Okay. If I'm the landlord, Steve's the defendant, I can't personally serve him myself because I'm a party to the case, but I can have anyone else do it that's kind of not working under me. And as long as he gets those papers in his hands on that Friday, the week before the Friday, we're good. It doesn't matter what the location is, doesn't matter the time of day. So personal service is actually the easiest to accomplish if it's actually done, okay? But there are a couple types of substitute service. These are more likely to be done incorrectly. Usually the only incorrect thing that I see with personal service is having the wrong person do the service. We'll get to that in a moment, okay? So substitute service at the bottom of this slide has a number of categories, number of requirements. And the reason is because now the person is serving the court papers on person A with the hope that person B actually gets them. So that's why we've got more qualifiers there, okay? So first of all, as a process server, I have to try to find B. I can't find B. So now I can give to A if I'm doing that at the residence, okay? And A has to be a person of suitable age and discretion. The case law doesn't tell us a lot about that. A has to be residing at the premises, okay? And so those are the qualifiers. What gets done wrong the most in this type of substitute service is giving the court papers to someone who's not of suitable age and discretion. And the most common flaw would be the babysitter. Well, two flaws. One would be giving them to a kid, okay? And the other would be giving them to the babysitter because the babysitter doesn't reside there. Right? Even if the babysitter lives next door, babysitter does not reside in the unit. Okay? Now, suitable age and discretion thing, what the courts have said is 13's probably good enough. I think if you get 11 or less, you're probably getting on the low end of suitable age. But also cognitive ability is an issue. I have a 20-year-old daughter with a developmental delay. We used to call that retardation. She functions like a preschooler. But she presents, if she's not talking, like a 25-year-old. If the court papers were delivered to her, that would not be a suitable age and discretion. I have a guardianship over her because her cognition is so low, okay? So I'll finish up with service alternatives, and then I'll say how we investigate this. I'm just looking down now and then at my phone, so I make sure I take the break at the right time. Okay. So mail and posting, this is the other type of alternative service. So we have personal, we have a substitute service on another person, and then we have mail and posting. And this has more requirements to it, because now the papers aren't even being given to somebody. They're just being stuck somewhere. And the idea is they're going to be stuck somewhere. We need more assurances that that somewhere is actually the right place. Okay? And so one of the preconditions is the process server has to have tried personal service on 2 different days, and at least once in the evening. Okay? So that's one requirement. And then a copy has to then be mailed. So you're unsuccessful those 2 times. Then you have to mail it to the tenant. Then you have to file an affidavit that you couldn't find, and you mail. And then you go back and post, right? So this has a few trips in it. It's got some trips to the courthouse. It's got some trips to the property. So you go to the courthouse to file a case, and then you go out to the property 2 different times. You're unsuccessful serving. You go back to the court. You file an affidavit. You mail it. You file an affidavit of mailing. Then you go back to the property again, and you post it. And then you go back to the court again, and you file an affidavit of posting. Okay? So 3 trips to the court, 3 trips to the property. Okay? Not that hard to do, but there is, and where I see the errors in this is actually with a law firm. Okay? And this law firm, they're not bad people, they're smart folks, but they've decided that they don't think the statute sequence. They think they can just kind of do all these things in any sequence they want. Okay? And so if you have the law firm of Hanbury and Turner on the plaintiff's side, and they're doing mail and posting, you want to look very carefully at the affidavits and see if they're doing the sequence. You might be thinking, well, why do we really care about the sequence? Well, we care about the sequence because if you don't do the sequence, you don't have personal jurisdiction. The court doesn't have the power to do anything. And the appellate courts have said that landlords have to strictly comply with this sequence. So what do you look at? Well, when you're down at court, the computer system in the VLN office has the inside access view of the court records, as opposed to when we look from our offices, we have the outside view. The outside view of court records just shows you a registry or a timeline of things that have happened and documents have been filed. They can't see the documents. When you're down at the VLN office at court, you have the inside view, and all those documents are hyperlinked, and you can click on them and look at them. And so when I have Hanbury and Turner on the other side, I mean, I'm pretty anal about this anyway, so I always look at the affidavits, but I look at them expecting to find something if it's a mail and post case. Because what they usually do, they go out to the property once, and they see, okay, not there. Then they mail it, okay? Then they go out to the property the second time. If they're unsuccessful, they post it. So now they've gone out to the, so essentially going to the court 2 times, going out to the property 2 times. And the reason why this is illegal is because they didn't have the authority to mail it until they went out to the property the second time and were unsuccessful. Okay? Now you might be thinking, I'm really dancing on the head of a pin. I am, right? But the legislature set up the pin and the court says we dance. Okay? So that's why we do that. And if I can find a personal service, if I can find a service defect, that's one of those defenses that Steve's mentioning that can give me some leverage in bargaining. And, you know, and if we're unsuccessful bargaining, then maybe the case gets dismissed. You might be thinking, well, great, McDonough, you got this case dismissed. All the landlord has to do is turn around and refile. And you're right. All they have to do is turn around and refile. But a couple things about that. One, most landlords aren't IFP eligible. So they're going to pay another filing fee. It's roughly around $300. It's going to slow the, you know, even if they do everything right, the second case, you know, they're not going to have the tenant out for maybe 3 weeks down the road. Okay. So there's some bargaining power here. And the other thing is that the power dynamics have changed. And Steve was talking a little bit about the appearances down there. And when tenants are unrepresented, landlords are represented, or landlords are very comfortable down there because they go there a lot. You might be thinking, Steve and I hate all landlords. We don't. there are lots of good landlords out there, and there are lots of good landlords that are having good faith disputes with tenants. And there are bad landlords out there. But advocating for tenants doesn't mean you have to sign an oath saying all landlords are bad. No. What we're doing is representing tenants, and we're trying to get kind of the best outcome for them. Okay? And so, but for landlords that go down there a lot, I think they do think that this is a service for them. Okay? That eviction is a service, and they're the customer, and we're the obstacle. Okay? And when a tenant is either successful getting a case dismissed or successful negotiating a settlement based on good faith defenses, the power balance changes. And tenants see exactly when that happens. They can tell the moment when that power balance changes. And even if the tenant ends up moving and the tenant's somewhat unhappy with the result, that tenant will remember exactly when that power balance changed and that there was someone there on their behalf. Okay? The cites here are to cases saying that the sequence that I said is the sequence and it has to be followed. Okay. I talked a little bit earlier about when somebody serves who shouldn't be serving. Rule 4.02 says that plaintiffs shall not be serving civil process and cases. Attorneys get to do it because they're officers of the court. So the issue is when the plaintiff's caretaker or manager does it. And there are a number of court decisions saying because that person is so closely connected with the plaintiff, they're not wholly disinterested, and therefore they can't be the right person to serve. So when I meet with tenants, even though they want to get right into the meat of the case, I kind of have to slow them down a little bit, say, you know, sorry, it's just me. I'm a sequential person. I like to go in chronological order. I want to start with, how did you get these court papers? Did someone give them to you? Did you find them somewhere? Someone gave them to you? Did you know who that person was? Okay? And so I might find out just by asking those questions that it was the manager who served the court papers on the babysitter who lives next door. Now I've got 2 service defenses in about 30 seconds, okay? And so those are the questions you can use to kind of tee that up. And then if you're down in the VLN office, or if you can go into the VLN office, or even to the court's computer, you can pull it up and look at the affidavits. You want to convince yourself that service is okay before you move on to other stuff, okay? All right, so now we're going to get into the other stuff. And what I have on my webpage, and I'm going to go to that in a minute, is a number of things to help you triage these cases. Now, in the packet that you've got here today, there are a couple of things here that help you triage cases. One is my answer form, and it has a lot of citations in it. But we also have in the Eviction Representation Project packet, there's also a really nice checklist there. The checklist and the answer form, to some extent, accomplish the same thing. I'm more used to using the answer form, so that kind of works better with my kind of brain, but the checklist works really well as well. Okay. I have a tenancies table. I don't think you're going to have to dip into that too often, but if you ever have a case involving subsidized housing, then you want to look at that to try to figure out which subsidized housing program. There are quite a few different subsidized housing programs. The most common ones are public housing and Section 8 vouchers and HUD subsidized projects, but there are other ones as well. So if you're presented with a case that involves subsidized or public housing, the tenancies table will help you figure out which one, and it'll point you to the answer form that's applicable to it. The answer form that you have here is for private housing, not subsidized or public housing. Also, if you're ever unsure, this is a good point to talk about the resources that are down at Housing Court. When you're down at Housing Court, you are not an island down there, okay? So let's say you're down there on a Wednesday afternoon. Who else is going to be down there? Lots of people, okay? There are 2 advice offices down there. There's a legal aid office and a volunteer lawyer's office. And it's really exciting to see all the people that were down there because I started this clinic when I was at Legal Aid back around early 2000s. And at first it was just another idea after several failed ideas about how to see tenants in bulk. And I tried inviting them to meetings and going down to the court and looking up all the addresses and sending out letters and having pizza and blah, blah, blah. And this clinic was kind of like the last effort. It's like, I've tried 5 things, they haven't worked. We'll try the clinic, and if it doesn't work, then I'm done trying to figure this out. And it worked, okay? And so because we're down there when folks are coming down for hearings, and because it's been around a long time, there's a kind of a good word of mouth that it's actually out there. And so sometimes people come down a couple days before their court hearing. In my life, that's like luxurious, right? Because now I'm triaging the case 2 days before the court hearing instead of the court hearing. For those of you that have practices that move slower, you might be thinking, wow, great, 2 days, big whoop, right? In my life, that's like huge. That's like I could go on a vacation in between the two and I'd still be ready, okay? So the clinic, so down at the clinic, you've got someone from legal aid doing the regular clinic shift. You've got 1 or 2 people, attorneys in the VLN clinic. You've got 1 or 2 VLN staff person down there. You've also got a legal aid attorney that's doing something similar to this project where they're down there just to pick up cases. And you, okay? That's a nice little crowd down there. And so if you have questions about whether this subsidized housing case, which one it is, just walk over to the legal aid office and just say, what is this? They'll be able to look at probably about 30 seconds and say, oh, that's a Section 8 voucher. You should use answer form number 3. Or they might say, you know, why don't we take that one? And then we'll switch. You take this private one, I'll take the subsidized one because I do subsidized ones all the time. Okay. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to take you over to the website. So I'm just going to, where do I want to click on this? I think I'll click on this one because this will take us over to the website. Yeah, so this is what my website looks like. I do web design, but this one is kind of no frills, no bells and whistles, no tunes, no videos. It's just words. So deal with it. Okay. So I've got my eviction manual on here. It is 600 pages. Don't print it off unless you don't really care about global warming. But if you're going to look at it on your browser, I would say use the HTML version. And the nice thing is all the links are activated in the table of contents. So if you decide you've got an issue of subtenancies and assignments, you click on it, it takes you right over to it, and then you can back up to the table of contents. So I think a real effective way of using this on a computer is to use it in a browser, HTML version, but you can certainly, you know, why aren't you going backwards? There we go. You can certainly take it down in other versions as well. And for those of you that don't know what WordPerfect is, I will talk to you about it. It is still the best word processing program out there, but you don't have to use it. Okay. So other things that I have on here, I've got links for looking up statutes, looking up rules, things like that. Yeah, I've got a referral page here. So let's say you're talking to someone about an eviction case, but you also realize they have some domestic violence issues that are unrelated to the eviction case. You could click on referrals there. You could look up family law, and you could see where to refer that person. It might be back to VLN, might be to legal aid, might be other places. Got someone with an immigration problem. In addition to this, I've got the immigration offices listed there as well, okay? So now I also have a bunch of answer forms. And so we'll go down, if you click on this, it takes you down to the bottom of this page. And if you pick up private answer, that's what you've got in your packet, okay? So I want to walk through some of the defenses here. We'll do this for about 6 minutes, and then I'll continue on and talk about a few more, okay? So this answer form, I developed this a long, long time ago. And it's because when I started doing this practice full-time at Legal Aid back in '86, it was like, man, if I could save some time here and spend more time getting to know my client and less time researching and less time drafting, I'd have more time for my client to actually figure out factually what's going on. And so I developed this answer form back in '86. I used it just myself at first because I wasn't sure if judges were going to go, oh, McDonough, you got to check off the box pleading here. That's really special. It turns out they were actually okay with it because I was pretty detail-oriented when I'd done, and they had all the sites there. And so I use this form when I use it as essentially a pleading, a motion document, an affidavit, all in one document, And so I've got the cites to the law, I've got requests for relief, I've got space to put in factual information, I've got the certifications at the end of it, so it essentially serves as an affidavit. So if you're using this document, you don't have to supplement with other documents the way you would in conventional motion practice, because there is a housing court rule that says we don't have to do that. Okay, so what I have in the answer formula, the first thing I do is I want to respond to the allegations in the complaint. And don't assume they're all right, okay? And don't ask general questions. Oh, is everything in the complaint okay? Don't ask that question. Say, okay, paragraph 1. Okay, paragraph 1 of the complaint. It says the tenancy started in June of 2018 and the rent's $1,000 a month and it's a written lease. And you might be thinking, well, that's probably right. Let's move on. Don't assume, okay? Say, okay, and don't say it's paragraph 1 right. Say, okay. Says you moved in on June 2018, is that right? Yeah, okay. Says you got a written lease, is that right? No. Really? You never got a written lease? No. Do you remember signing anything? No. Okay, all right. Says the rent's $1,000. Is it $1,000 when you moved in? No. Is it $1,000 now? Yeah. Well, when did it go up? I'm not sure. I think it was in November. The landlord just came out and said the rent's going to be $1,000 for December. Okay, so right away, I've got a defense. And the defense is that the landlord improperly raised the rent. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But by asking more detailed questions about every sentence that's in the complaint, you may find more stuff. And these complaints aren't large. We're not talking about a 50-page class action complaint. We're talking about a complaint that's most often 1 page long with some boxes. Even if it's been drafted by an attorney, it'd be a rare day that it's more than 3 pages double-spaced. So you can actually take the time to do this, and you're going to find some information that way. Okay. So I want to figure out, what do I admit, what do I deny, and where do I punish? Maybe I don't know. And so chances are you're going to find something. Okay. Now, B gets at just kind of getting in your own mind, are we talking about a term lease? Are we talking like a month-to-month or a periodic tenancy, which are still pretty common, or if we have a foreclosed mortgage or a canceled contract for deed? Because those cases end up in housing court as well. When a redemption period has expired in a mortgage foreclosure, if the occupants don't leave, the holder of the mortgage has to file an eviction case. Those are pretty uncommon. We saw a lot of those 10 years ago in the foreclosure crisis. We don't see them that often. Okay? But this answer form works for those types of cases as well. The main difference between term leases and month-to-month tenancies is that in a term lease, the landlord can really only end the lease if the tenant has not paid the rent or has breached the material term of the lease. Otherwise, the landlord has to wait for it to expire. Okay? In a month-to-month tenancy, which is the most common kind of non-term tenancy, they can be of other durations. I mean, you could really have a day-to-day tenancy, but I've never seen one. Okay, month-to-month is the most common. The landlord can file an eviction case for non-payment of rent or a breach of it, but also could give a proper notice to end it and then file a case because the tenant didn't move out when they should have. Okay, and that's called a holding over case. So it's always good to kind of have in your mind, are we dealing with a term lease or a month-to-month tenancy? Because it does change the analysis a little bit. Okay, got about another minute here. So before we take the break. So the next thing I have here is just the service defenses. And so these are really all the things we just discussed, okay? But they're laid out kind of from a defensive standpoint. Now, part of the reason I have in here the strict compliance thing, you might be thinking, well, that's not really a defense, that's just saying what the law is. Well, it's really just to remind the judicial officers that this matters. Now, I think the referees get that, but there was a time when some of the referees, I think, thought close enough was good enough on service. And so that's why I had this paragraph here to say, no, it's not good enough, it has to be strict compliance. And then I've got the different defenses kind of laid out here, that the court papers weren't served 7 days before, they're served on a legal holiday, that the person who served, number 4, is the wrong person to do it, that substitute service on another person had one of these errors, or that mail and post service had one of these errors. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is take a short break. How long a break did you have in mind?
5 minutes.
So we'll take a 5-minute break. Did you want to say anything else in advance of the break?
Nope, just come back in 5 minutes and we'll see you then.
Yeah, and then we'll move on to other defenses and some other topics. Fine. See you in a few minutes.
So I had a question. So I'm kind of new to this, staffing the vagaries.
Sure.
But I'm staffing vagaries, housing court clinic
Yep.
on Mondays the last 2 years. And I feel, and I feel like this is super helpful by the way, especially because unfortunately a lot of candidates, because they're the easier cases. Cycle through to legal basis. Just like non-paid.
And we're going to get into those in a moment.
You know, so I always feel a little bit sort of hamstrung, like me and the Cargill attorney staffing.
I feel like there's nothing you can do.
Yes.
Right,
You know
we'll,
what I mean?
we'll talk about that.
Okay, but I feel like now, I mean, you're annotated super duper, like I feel like this is very helpful because then maybe we can raise more service
Yeah.
issues,
You might find more.
I might find more service issues now that I understand how strict compliance is. But I guess, are you suggesting then that we'll, like, we can keep it out and check the right things off?
Yep.
And then that person should go in
Yep.
and argue the strict compliance
Yep.
thing?
Yep.
Is that what you're suggesting?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
as opposed to just using their generic form
Right.
that we have in that
Yep.
VLN office.
Yeah, and you've got this form in the VLN office.
Oh, do we?
Yep.
Okay, I wasn't
Yep.
sure.
It's one of the first forms on the upper file cabinet right after the IFP form.
Okay, I have another question.
Yep.
Is the IFP form, does that need to be notarized?
Nope.
No.
Because now there was a statutory change a few years ago that said that if certain language is in a document, it doesn't have to be notarized anymore.
Oh, so what is that, generally, what's that magic language?
Well, it's on the form here, so I've got it on the answer form here. So it's, this is a certification regarding.
But would this be in generic IFP forms that they hand out?
Yeah, and this is the language. Declare on perjury.
Okay, so now it no longer needs to.
So
Okay,
like if
good.
you look at the IFP form,
Okay.
basically saying the same thing.
Oh, great.
So it no longer has a
Okay, so when
place.
did that start?
It's about maybe
No.
pretty recent, maybe
Me and Gomez
3
were
years ago,
talking
something
about
like that,
this.
3 years ago.
Yeah.
So you'll see this form doesn't have.
Yeah, right, okay, good. Okay, yeah, because, so,
Well, my like Kamala Harris lectured me
That's right,
yesterday.
I'm
And so I was like, I need you to explain this.
rent escrow /
Like, this is a habit
rate.
program.
And
And then it just sent me this article.
so next Friday morning, we're going out to meet with clients.
Oh,
And I'd be happy to talk to you about that too, because I've done lots of those.
Oh, okay,
Yep.
that would.
We're just focusing on the eviction stuff today.
Yeah,
but
no, so that would be
they're in the LA.
So,
There's
apart from maybe it hasn't been in a while.
Like I said, 2 days.
Any affidavit we had our clients
Okay.
sign at her house would have to be notarized.
Nope.
Raphael, class.
Hi.
Nothing.
Yeah.
And I went into twice of the
We'll have to have
So have you guys, for any of the housing court clinics?
Yeah.
I'm in, just
I've
one
done
in
a couple of
April.
them, but I haven't put in their case
So
to
I-
Excel yet, just because I had gotten.
Oh, yeah, so who have you gone with?
Some guy was actually a student.
Nick,
No.
Yeah.
They-
Heather.
yeah,
Okay,
yes, and then
next-
already talked to her once, and then,
Okay.
3.5 hours. Nick, is it Brett Chattel?
Oh, is it Don Parent? Yeah.
From Bizlife.
He should have been down. 'Cause-
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Maybe
so
we can,
that is, it's a great experience. I feel like before.
He's
He's
one
one
of
of
the,
them.
he's
Yeah,
one of
he's
the
one
ones
of
that
them.
got
He was
sued.
the
too, yeah,
Yeah.
they were both actually like,
Yeah.
feel like, even if
Yeah.
but anyway, so yeah.
Are really quick.
I'll talk about that when we talk about that.
I'm still, well, no, he would
Shy about actually
Particularly
not a
if
full
they're
representation, but I
we
think
wanted.
This is
for that housing board.
It really is.
It's a sign
So
of-
super helpful. Even just
So you
feel
end
like,
up feeling
Yeah,
like a
they're-
lot.
You know,
yes,
Well, and-
I'm
you know,
totally
and-
gonna be able to like.
Yeah, I'll respond to
when I
that
do that
basically
housing
the
board,
answer.
that I'm gonna be helping
That's
way
how they
more.
want to.
Even if I never take.
Conversations, and you don't
Cool,
have
you can just fill these out for
Yes.
them. It's so helpful.
Yeah, and most of them we do housing board.
because they didn't know how to react. I went in there with
Fill
them.
this out and then IFP.
I like.
Oh.
I signed up, so mine the
Okay.
So,
like
anyway,
booked up because
I
she
mean-
scheduled me for one in April.
sort of.
Well, but I'll tell you
Okay.
right now, like what inevitably happens is that like it was the media go because of something. And they sent out a panicked email like that Monday morning or the previous Friday or something like, oh, it turns out that like, you know,
Yeah.
so and so can go on Monday, can anyone else take it?
Okay, good to
Okay,
know.
so I'm just
Yeah,
like,
sometimes in the
if you wanna go sooner than that, I'm like 99% sure that you can give me the option to volunteer
Perfect.
early for that.
Yeah, I did. That's who scheduled me to do.
Yeah.
I was gonna email her after this.
Yeah, so that's really nice and it's kind of low stress because you're always there with a cargo, right? You're always there with a cargo person. That's also super interesting. Like I actually like really good bonding. Consistent, you know, cargo client relationships. You know, but like, I mean, but like, you know, finding out and yeah. So I highly recommend the housing board. The idea of like as like protect your skin.
Can you tell them otherwise?
When I first got there, it was the voting order for protection, like, you got us, like, the whole receipt that us, it was, it's tough, do you know what I mean, like, and I feel like this, I can't, like, be like, super helpful. Like, and, you know, like, only, like, patient, you know, like, so, the great thing about that is, like, there's so many great programs I go through, so I've, like, finished this.
Meet her new one.
I mentioned my new housing course.
Okay, we're gonna get started again. So I'm gonna pick up where we left off and talk about some other areas of defenses. I'm not gonna go into all of them. The answer form is kind of a nice way to highlight them. You might think it has all of them because it's so darn long, but it actually doesn't. And so what I would recommend that you do before you take your first case is look over the answer form, just kind of familiarize yourself with some of the defenses there, but also go to, let's see, where do I want to go right now? Then I would also, be for a second. Okay, I'd also go, I'll back up for a second, go to my manual and just browse through the table of contents. Okay, because for instance, if there's anything that kind of piques your interest, maybe take a look at it. But for instance, when you get to the area of non-payment of rent defenses, which is down here, you know, if you find that you want to read more about habitability, you certainly could. But even the defenses that I have here are more extensive than what I have in the answer form. So I'm not saying you have to look at all that stuff, but just maybe just browsing the table of contents might be a good way just to kind of remind you or just let you know of some of the things that are out there. Okay. And even in the answer form, you know, the chances that you're going to have more than 2 or 3 defenses out of all the ones that are in this answer form are probably unlikely. I mean, occasionally I'll have a case where there might be 10 or 12 defenses, but that's not real common. Okay, so some of the preconditions that I take a look at is, and I'm just going to highlight ones that I think come up more often. I always, the plaintiff has to be entitled to the property. You might be thinking, well, duh, okay, and it is kind of a duh. But the way you figure out is you know, talk to the client, just say, so ABC Management is the plaintiff here. Do you know who they are? Yeah, they signed a lease with me, and do you know if they own the property? Well, I guess I don't know, okay? So back on my webpage, if you go to links, you can actually, there's a link for looking up property addresses in Hennepin County. You can look at a City of Minneapolis website from Housing Inspections. You can also look at a Hennepin County website. There are cases where A will be the plaintiff, B will have signed the lease, C owns the property, and D has the rental license. And then, so who's the right plaintiff? Not sure. So then what I do is kind of check off this one and say, let them prove it. Let them prove that they're the one that's entitled to possession. So I usually do a check of the plaintiff, and I go to my links page of that, so I'll just show you back where that is. And all this stuff is on the computer down at in the VLN office. So down in links, that's this one. And it's got its own little table of contents as well. I've got favorites, the ones that I use the most often. So when I've got a landlord plaintiff, one of the things I want to take a look at is figure out, I look at the Hennepin County website, look at the Minneapolis website. What do I find out from those? I find out who's the owner, who's the taxpayer. I find out from the Minneapolis website if the landlord has a rental license, which is important in non-payment of rent cases, which we'll get to in a moment. If the landlord has a business name, I try to see if it's registered with the Secretary of State's office. If it isn't, the case has to be put on hold until they register, and the tenant gets $250. Okay? So these are things that I look at kind of standard in any case, just related to the identity of the plaintiff. Okay? And then I have places where to cover that in the answer form. So now we're going to go back to the answer form. And back to preconditions. So I like to just do, and looking up these links maybe takes me a couple of minutes. I mean, this is not a labor-intensive process. Okay. All right. So then, if there's someone there who's not an attorney, who's representing an entity, I want to see if there's a power of authority in the file. So let's say I've got, you know, Larry McDonough Properties, and I've got Steve coming in as my landlord representing me. Well, there's certain times when that is legal, and there's certain times when not. If I'm an unincorporated business, it's just Larry McDonough Properties, or I'm Larry and just an individual, there is a rule that would allow Steve, if he were a non-attorney, to come in and be my agent there. The case law doesn't allow Steve to come in as a non-attorney and represent a corporate landlord, even though the referees tend to allow that to happen. But there's appellate case law on that, and we'll get to that in a moment. But sometimes I'll see a power of authority as 10 years old and has been photographed to death or photocopied to death. There's a pretty good case for arguing that that's not a proper power of authority in this case, if it's that old. Okay. This is the issue about corporations being represented by attorneys. This is one of those issues where the case law is like pretty solid, but the referees in Hennepin County think that local rules mean that that case law doesn't apply. Whenever I have a corporate landlord that's represented by a non-attorney, I raise this issue, and I'm not expecting to get anywhere with the referees if I litigated it. But if I litigated and lost and I appealed it either to a judge, to the Court of Appeals, I think I'd probably do okay on it. Okay? But I always raise it. And every time I've raised this, I've either won the case or I've settled the case, so I've never had an opportunity to appeal it up. Okay? But so if it's a corporate landlord represented by a non-attorney, I check this off. Some other things that I look at, the tenant has to know an address for the landlord, okay? And you might think that most tenants know that. Maybe when you're a tenant, you always knew that. The slumlord crowd, not the regular landlord crowd, they don't like to do this because they don't want to get sued over having crappy places. So they give out cell phones, they give out post office boxes, things like that. So I always ask, do you have an address for your landlord? When did you find out? Probably 19 times out of 20, they will have had that information, and I move on. Number 7, I really find this more relevant in non-rent cases, like breach of lease cases. The the statute requires fact pleading in eviction cases, while in other types of litigation in Minnesota, those are notice pleading cases, while eviction cases by statute are fact pleading cases. So if I have a case and the landlord is very vague about the breach of lease that occurred, then I might say that this was a failure to articulate the facts with enough sufficiency. So those are the most common ones that I see for preconditions. Now I want to talk about non-payment of rent cases. These are by far the most common. I've never kind of analyzed this on a percentage basis, but I would be kind of surprised if non-payment of rent cases did not make up 80 to 90% of the eviction cases go through the court system. So these are the most common. We're going to spend less time talking about holding over cases and breach of lease cases because of that. Okay. So non-payment of rent cases, the most common defense by far is habitability. And to some degree, it shouldn't be a big surprise. Poor people are not renting fancy places. Okay? And now there are a lot of poor people that rent places that meet habitability requirements. But there's a pretty high percentage of folks that don't. And so in every non-payment of rent case, even if the tenant doesn't raise it, I figure out a way to ask about it. And it's okay to ask your client questions about things. That's not like putting on leading testimony in trial. We're not in a trial at this point. We are investigating. And so, you don't have to say that, boy, if you had a habitability defense, that would be really good. You don't have to ask it that way. Just say, so what's your place like? Kind of good, bad, in between? And sometimes tenants are kind of used to it. And so they don't tell you anything right away. And so I said, well, is there anything that's not working? Well, yeah, sure, there's things that are not working. Okay, let's talk about that. And usually 2 or 3 questions into it, you'll either figure out that there are habitability issues or not. And this concept of habitability, you might be thinking, well, to be habitable, it just needs to be like not falling in on you, right? That's not, so the concept, the term's a little bit of a misnomer, because what it means is it like this really minimal level of not dying in your apartment. It's really what the law says is it has to be maintained in reasonable repair, fit for the use intended, and in compliance with housing codes. So what we're really talking about is habitability is a fairly high standard. It's not this kind of don't kill me low standard, right? And there can be all kinds of things related to heat, utility, just things that aren't working. I mean, let's say you have a fridge and it's not working, and that was part of what was promised is, not every place has to have a fridge, but if that was part of the deal moving in, then it has to be maintained, okay? Same thing with air conditioning. Air conditioning isn't required, but if that was what was promised, it has to be maintained, even though had there been no air conditioning in the first place, that would have been legal, okay? So those are the things, and what you try to figure out is where is this on a level of severity, not so much as to whether you're going to articulate it or not, but to get a sense as to how strong you think it will be. Because why do we raise habitability in a rent case? We raise it because it might reduce the rent. Okay? The case law is that the landlord has to maintain the property in order to get the full rent. If they don't maintain the full habitability, they're not entitled to the full rent. And so the analytical framework is, how does this disrepair affect this person, and then how do we quantify it? Now, you don't have to be a math nerd on this, because there really isn't any kind of mathematically nerdy way to quantify it, so it always is a little bit of a mushy concept. But my theory on this is actually pretty basic. If the judicial officer get creeped out, you get a big rent abatement. And if they think, yeah, I rented worse, you don't. Okay, and so you have mice, roaches, you have bugs in a baggie, that's going to creep somebody out. If it's like the door squeaks, it's not. Okay, and so that's kind of the analytical framework. We'll talk in a few minutes about doing trials and how to present this evidence. Okay, but habitability, the most common non-payment of rent defense by far. Okay, probably the second most common would be the next one, lack of a rental license. Okay. Now again, how do you figure out if there's a rental license? Most cities in Hennepin County require rental licenses, but some don't. I've got a table on my website as to which do and which don't, and I'm working on updating that right now. Most of the cases you see in Hennepin County are from Minneapolis. Minneapolis does require a rental license, and you can look up at that City of Minneapolis website that I had on my links in my favorites. You can look up there, you can find out who's the owner of the property. You can also find out whether there's a rental license, okay? If there's no rental license, there are court decisions saying no rent is due because the lease itself is illegal, okay? It's an illegally, basically created lease. Now, the referees are not kind of unified on that. There aren't any reported appellate decisions saying what I just said. There's unreported appellate decisions saying that. So that still kind of leaves it for referees and judges to kind of decide where they go with this. And so it's a little bit hard to predict. But the lack of a license, and usually the lack of a license is also going to, if there's no rental license, there's probably a reason why there's no rental license. And if you haven't figured out any habitability things from what we just discussed, I'd probably go back and chat about that some more. Because the reason for not having a rental license is two reasons. One, less common these days because rental licenses have been around in Minneapolis for almost 20 years. Okay? So it's possible ignorance, but that is really less likely. It's more likely I don't want to get on the city's radar screen because I'm renting out a crappy place, so that's why I don't have a rental license. So if you find no rental license and you haven't found any habitability things, I'd kind of go back over that territory again and talk a little bit about it. Because again, a lot of tenants are kind of used to places not working and not being that clean and not being that fixed up. And so they might be thinking, you know, the attorney really doesn't need to know about this because I've been living in places like this for 15 years. So I really want to talk about why I didn't pay the rent. Okay. Okay. Some other things that I take a look at. I take a look at number 6, shared meters. I look at this if I've got like a duplex or a triplex, okay? So what a shared meter is when you've got one utility meter that's covering more than one residential unit, or at least covering more than one residential unit. I've never seen them in anything bigger than a triplex. So I ask, you know, how many units in this place? There are 2, okay? Now I want to talk about utilities, even though tenants thinking, you know, utilities aren't the problem here. You know, I've paid all the utilities. Well, I know you've paid all the utilities, but maybe you didn't have to pay all the utilities. So what's the deal with shared meters? If there's a shared meter, you're trying to figure out how many units there are, and are you only paying for your own unit, or are you paying for something beyond? And tenant might be thinking, well, I think I'm paying for my own unit. Well, which unit are you? Well, it's an up-down duplex. Which one are you in? I'm in the down, okay? All right. Do you know how many meters there are in the basement? Yeah, there are 2, okay. Who's covering the basement? I don't know. You're covering the basement. Because in up-down duplexes, that's usually, I mean, I've never seen an up-down duplex with 2 meters where the downstairs wasn't covering the basement, okay. Now, the upstairs person may not have a shared meter because theirs might only be the upstairs. How do tenants figure this out? Well, the utility can come out and do a thing called a tracer, but you can also do something that's really informal. You just go to the basement and you turn on the light in the basement, you turn on the light in your unit, pull out the fuse, and if the light in your unit goes out and the light in the basement goes out, you got a shared meter. Right? Why do we care about that? Well, if it's a shared meter and it wasn't done legally, just like a non-licensed unit, the obligation of the tenant to pay the utilities was an illegal obligation. Tenant not only has a claim to get that back, they have a claim to get 3 times that back under the shared meter statute, okay? So again, if it's a 20-unit building, I don't ask, okay? If it's a triplex or less, I ask. And I'd say when I've got a triplex or less, I'd say the chances of there being a shared meter problem, probably 25%. It's a lot. Okay. How can a landlord do it right? Well, they can do it right by having something in the lease that says this is a shared meter, by having something in the lease about saying how I'm divvying it up to try to be fair. Okay. they also have to have shown the tenant 12 months of usage before the tenant signed the lease, so the tenant knew what they're getting into. Because shared meters, you don't control your destiny so much because your destiny is controlled a little bit by other people. It's quite rare to find a landlord who's done all those things correctly, okay? So one other thing about shared meters. Okay, let's say tenant A is paying the electricity and tenant B is paying the heat. Isn't that a wash? No, it's utility specific, right? So that means there's shared meters going on for both. And if they haven't done the things I just mentioned, they're both illegal. Okay? Improper late fees. I see this as less of an issue than I used to see. There was a statutory change in 2010, effective in 2011, that requires late fees to be 8% or less of what has not been paid. Okay? Most of you that have been tenants probably had flat late fees and leases. It's still okay to have a flat late fee, but if the landlord's trying to get the late fee, it has to be 8% or less of what has not been paid. Now, you don't have to be, I am a math nerd, but usually the math on this is relatively easy. Well, let me give you an example. Let's say we got a $1,000 rent and we've got a $50 late fee. Okay, that's okay, because that's 5%. But let's say I pay $500 of the 1,000. Now the eviction case is for the $500 balance and the $50 late fee. Now it's a 10% late fee, it's illegal. Okay? So you try to do you do the math on the late fee versus what the landlords have in the case right now. Now, sometimes you'll have cases where landlords have been charging late fees every month and the tenants paid that late fee. I'm not so sure we can go back and attack those past late fees. But let's say the tenant didn't pay the late fees and the landlord's case right now is essentially for the late fees. So let's say I didn't pay, $200 in late fees, but I'm current with my rent. And the landlord's saying, I owe $200. Then I'd be saying, well, that's like, for those of you that are math nerds, that would be infinity percent, right? Because it's $200 compared to no rent due. Oh, I thought you guys would be excited about that. Anyway, clearly more than 8%, right? So I do see that less than I used to, but I still see it now and then. Okay, now my last hypothetical just raised the next issue, which is number 8. Tenant paid $500, has $500 left, okay? The landlord can, if the landlord wants to go after that $500 balance, they have to have something in writing, either in the lease or in a receipt that says they have the right to do that. If a landlord accepts a part payment of rent without putting something in writing that preserves the right to go for the balance, they can't evict for the balance, okay? And sometimes you see this right in the complaint. The complaint says $1,000 rent, evicting for $500 in January. Right away, it's saying part payment of rent. There's got to be a part payment of rent here. So then I ask about that, okay? And sometimes, and more often what I'll see is maybe $500 from December, $1,000 for January, okay? And then if the landlord didn't have this written statement in a lease or a receipt, then the $500 for December ought to be shaved off the eviction case, and the eviction case would only be for the $1,000 for January. Now, it doesn't mean the tenant doesn't know that. Sorry about the double negative. The tenant still owes that $500, but the landlord doesn't have the remedy of eviction to go after the $500. Okay? Issue with money orders is that if money orders are proof of rent being paid, and landlords are supposed to give receipts for payments of cash. Most of them don't. There isn't really an enforcement mechanism on that statute. But where I see this coming up is, let's say the landlord is saying that I owe rent from December, and I'm saying I paid rent in December, I paid in cash, and the landlord didn't give me any receipts for it. And I can show that I paid. I can say that, well, I paid in cash in November and September. And landlord, you got any receipts for that? No. Okay. So I can kind of use that against the landlord to say, well, then you're having trouble meeting your burden of proof because you never give your receipts. Okay? That's not something that comes up that often. Okay? So I'd say in non-payment of rent, the issues that come up the most often are habitability and licensure, and then after that, maybe shared meters, and then after that, probably part payments of rent and late fees. Okay. I want to finish off with this, and then, because I want to talk about Volunteer Lawyers Network's revolving fund to help in habitability cases, but I want to go through the rest of this first. So I'm going to go through the rest of the answer form quicker because these other types of cases come up less often. The next category of cases, F, holding over cases. These are cases where the landlord's saying that the tenant was supposed to move because the tenancy expired and didn't. And there are two ways that expiration would happen. One, a term lease ends on its own account. The lease ended at the end of December. I didn't move. Landlord's saying I'm holding over on the property. Or the landlord is saying we got a month-to-month tenancy. I gave you a notice to move out at the end of December. You didn't move out. You're holding over on the property. So those are holding over cases. The most common by far are the month-to-month notice cases. The expiration of lease cases, much less common. Okay. The issues that come up there. Number one, they got to attach the notice to you have to attach the notice to complaint or provide it at the first hearing. Cases are dismissed for just not doing that. Okay, so if they're alleging notice, got to have a copy of the notice. Now, even if the tenant received the notice and has a copy of it, the landlord still has to attach it to the complaint or provide it at the first hearing. Okay, other issues, the notice has to be proper. Most landlords do a proper notice, but there's still a chunk that don't get it. If I had a dime for every time someone says it's a 30-day notice, it's only a 30-day notice in a 30-day month. It's a month notice, okay? And so if it's a notice that's given on May 1 to be out May 31, it's a bad notice for two reasons. It's not a month notice, but the other reason is it has to be received before the rent is due for the last month, okay? So it would have to be received on April 30th or before to be effective May 31, okay? And if it's mailed on the 30th, unless their mail is different planet than mine, it's not going to get there on the 30th, right? So improper notice, that doesn't come up a lot, but it still comes up a bit. The most common one by far is the next one, retaliation. And this is where the tenant says, I had the housing inspector come out, and then a couple weeks later, I got a notice to move out. Right? And let's say the notice is a proper notice. It's a 1-month notice. It was received before the rent is due for the last month. But if I did something to enforce my rights in good faith, like call a housing inspector, call the police, complain to the landlord about repairs or neighbors or whatever, as long as I've done it in good faith, and if I did it in a 90-day window before the notice was given, not before the effective date of the notice, but before the notice was given, then there's a presumption of a retaliation that the landlord has to disprove. And the bar on disproving is really high. Okay? And so I then look, so for this hypothetical notice given at the end of November to be out the end of December, now I'm looking at a window of November, October, September. Did I do anything to enforce my rights in that time period in good faith? Okay? Now, usually I don't have to go back to September. Usually, if the tenants enforced their rights, it was like a couple of weeks before the notice, not like 89 days before. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe they haven't done it. But this is one of those areas where tenants think the tendency is to not complain about things. They're actually better protected if they complain, right? It's really counterintuitive to tenants. They're thinking, don't rock the boat, right? And I'm not saying rock the boat just for fun, but if there's something there, rock the boat, you actually have better protection. Because again, the bar on disproving the presumption of retaliation is really high, okay? And the manual kind of goes into kind of what the standard is on that. Landlords also can waive notices to move out. That doesn't happen that often, but if I had a notice to move out at the end of December and the landlord collects rent for January, they've waived that notice to move out. And there is case law that also says that if the landlord files an eviction case in January saying, I owe rent for January and I didn't move out at the end of December, that asking for the rent in the pleading is a waiver because now it's a demand for rent for a period beyond when I moved out. Okay. A lot of tenants want to raise discrimination in eviction cases, and I'm not real excited about doing that. Not because I disbelieve the claim of discrimination. I generally think that when people are claiming it, there's probably something to it. But the parameters for investigating and litigating discrimination in an eviction case are challenging because you don't have that much time. And if you litigate it and you lose it, you've not only lost it for the eviction case, you've lost it for the client, and you've lost it for any agency that wants to raise the same claim on behalf of the client. Okay? So usually if I'm talking to someone about discrimination, unless it's something that's really on its face, like a lease provision that is kind of categorizing people in different suspect classes differently, which it happens now and then, but it's really pretty rare. Outside of that, that's about the only time I've litigated discrimination. So what I tell someone is to say, you know, I get what you're saying here, but I think if we raise that in this case, we don't have enough time to develop it, and I'm worried that if we lose it, you won't have another shot at this. I think we should not raise that here, but I want to give you a referral to this attorney that could help you out with it, or to one of the agencies that prosecute it. Okay, and lastly, for breach of lease cases, the main issues that I look at there, I'd say the most common one that comes up is it material or not? Now, whenever it's a breach of lease case, the landlord's got to attach the lease, just like if it's a notice case, they have to attach the notice. Okay? But most landlords, and good and bad, think that if I've got 39 rules on my lease, you got to follow them, and if you miss one of them, I get to evict you because it's a contract, and I get to set the rules, and you didn't comply. Okay? The standard is you can evict for a material violation of lease, and I've got a little language from what the courts have to say about it. They're saying it's got to be kind of big deal stuff. Now, some cases are going to be kind of obvious. I mean, if the landlord's claiming that I'm the drug dealer kingpin and I'm threatening my neighbor, if they can prove that, that's going to be material, right? But the cases, or I think the cases that get more into this area is, well, I'm too noisy. Okay, well, let's figure out what's going on there, okay? Now, it may be that I am too noisy, that I'm having parties all the time and all the other tenants are threatening to leave. Okay, probably material, right? Let's say I've got a really picky downstairs neighbor who pretty much every time I walk across the wood floor is calling up and say, keep it down, right? Now, I am noisy, right? But is that a material violation of the lease? Probably not, okay? So it kind of depends on kind of context. Another example, I've seen leases that say, well, you can't, we've got a balcony, you can't have your bicycle on the balcony, okay? Okay, well, why is that, okay? Because I don't like the looks of kind of untidy balconies? Probably not material. Is there a fire code that says you can't have certain things on balconies? Yes, probably material. So it's kind of a factual, contextual thing. But most landlords aren't analyzing the case that way. They're just analyzing lease, violation, evict. And our analysis is lease, violation or not, material or not, evict or not. Okay. Other things that come up in the breach area would be that, I don't see this too often anymore, but leases, number 5 here, leases have to have a clause that says you can evict for a violation. It's called a right of reentry clause. Most standard leases have that right now. There's still a lot of landlords that get leases off the internet, okay, and that are not Minnesota specific. And if they don't have this right of reentry clause, they cannot evict for breach, okay? They just can't do it. They can evict for non-payment of rent, but they can't evict for breach, okay? Other things that come up, landlords can, number 7 and 8, landlords can waive terms in the lease by not enforcing them over a long period of time. This tends to come up with no pet provisions in leases where management changes. First management had it in there, but they didn't really care about it because it was some sort of standard lease form. New manager cares about it. You've had your pet for like 3 years. There are a number of court decisions, both district court and appellate, saying that by acquiescing that long, the landlord can essentially modify the lease, waive that provision. The more common type of waiver is just not acting fast enough on a specific event. So let's say I've got a provision in the lease that says no loud parties, and I, in fact, have a loud party. But that was back on October 15th. Maybe the Vikings actually won a game and I was excited or something, right? But then I didn't have many of those parties later when they stopped doing that, right? And so now the landlord's got this breach of lease case in January for that really loud party in October. So that presents a waiver issue because they've been accepting rent since then. Now, a landlord can overcome that with a non-waiver clause, but interestingly enough, there is precedent for waiving a non-waiver clause. You gotta love that, right? So when is that gonna happen? Probably not in my scenario, but let's say I had some violation from maybe a year ago and there's a non-waiver clause and now the landlord wants to raise it now because for whatever reason they just don't like me or whatever. I could see the court saying, well, wait a second, we're not gonna let you rest on this non-waiver clause when you waited a whole year. Couple other things that come up in the breach area is issues of disability. Let's say I'm loud, but the reason I'm loud is because I have Tourette's and my medication isn't working right now. Tourette's is a disability where the person who's suffering from it may kind of have loud, uncontrollable kind of noises and statements, sometimes swearing. It can be kind of outburst kinds of things. If that's a landlord has an obligation to reasonably accommodate my disability. Now, it doesn't mean I get kind of like a clean slate to be like Mr. Jerk or anything. No. But if there's a causal connection between my disability and the breach, the landlord's got to cut me a little bit of slack. And that might just be holding off the eviction where I've got some time to work with my attorney and my doctor to maybe change my meds and help me be more compliant. Okay. But whenever I have a breach of lease case, I do try to find out if there's any causal connection between a disability of anybody in the household and the alleged breach. And lastly, in the breach area, sometimes you'll have landlords alleging in number 12 different types of unlawful activity. Usually it would be drug-related. And that there's a very powerful defense in the statute. I was involved with the lobbying on this, and I wanted to have kind of an innocence kind of defense in there, and that's basically 12A. Not 12A, but 12B. And so the most common kind of drug issue that I've seen in my experience is the kid. So it's not mom, it's not dad, it's 16-year-old kid and his or her buddies are smoking pot in the bedroom. Mom doesn't even know what pot is, okay? Thinks they're smoking cigarette, and this is an apartment building where you can smoke cigarettes, right? And so if the tenant didn't know or have reason to know that there was unlawful activity going on, that is a black and white defense to this type of case. All right, so the last thing I've got in the answer form is I got requests for relief. The requests for relief are kind of based on different things that you've claimed. I had a question back.
Yes, I did. If the lease hasn't been attached to the complaint,
Yep.
it says that it has to be given at the hearing. But is that like, would that be before we see the client? How are we actually when you go in?
No, so there's kind of like a two-hearing process in eviction cases if you're doing trials. So one is the arraignment. The arraignment is a first appearance hearing. They're at 1:15 in the afternoons every day of the week. So the landlord would have to present it either attached to the lease or present at that hearing. So, if you're going out and talk to the landlord and you just say, well, the lease wasn't attached, you got it. If they don't have it, then that's a pretty good indication they're not going to be able to present it at the hearing.
But so you'll get it by the time you.
Well, if they have it, right. Yep.
I'm sorry, where were you referring to?
So she's referring to the very beginning of the breach of lease defenses, which would be on page 7, paragraph G1. The landlord has an obligation to attach the lease when asserting violation of a lease.
Or
give it
to you.
Right, they have an obligation to attach it.
Oh, they do.
But they can kind of escape the violation by providing it at the hearing. Okay, yes.
So how does that work mechanically I assume at this meeting, doing this handy dandy form to provide your answer at the hearing, but if you don't have the lease to look at, how do you fill out your
Well,
motion?
if the lease was not attached, I check off the box. And then it's up to them, if I don't have any conversation with the landlord before the hearing, then it's up to them to respond to this by presenting a copy at the hearing.
And then you get it, and then you submit a new answer or
Nope,
something?
nope, then they've just wiped out one of my defenses, but I don't have to submit a new answer. Because the answer was accurate at the time that I drafted it. Yep.
But the lack of attachment of lease is not a defense to a simple non-payment case, is that
Correct.
correct? Okay.
Correct.
And you said that 80 to 90% of these cases
Yep.
are not paid, okay.
Yep. Okay, yes.
What's the legal foundation for not knowing that there was a violation of the lease and being a defense? So if your defense to the breach of the unlawful activity is that you didn't know about it?
Yep.
Is that statute, is that rule, where's the foundation for that?
It's right in 504B.171. It's one of the defenses that's in there. So if the landlord is asserting illegal drugs, it's a defense that the tenant did not know or have reason to know of the activity. Yep. And everything in this answer form has a citation right next to the defense. So for requests for relief, a lot of it is just kind of based on what you're alleging as defenses. And things that I check off every time when I'm doing the answer would be one, we want to win, right? So that'd be number one. And then the other ones, 2, 3, 4, depend on kind of what I'm asserting. I pretty much always want number 5, discovery. I want to know who their witnesses are. I want to know what their documents are going to be. So I do that every time usually, and then I do 11 every time. If we lose, give us more time to move. I do 12 every time, which if we win, give us costs and disbursements. I do 13 every time. We want an expungement, and then I check off whichever box I think is appropriate, and I'll talk about expungements in a few minutes. I do want to make a note about attorney's fees. If the lease has a provision that allows for attorney's fees for the landlord, a statute that I helped work on in 2010 makes that reciprocal by implication. So that means if there's a lease provision saying landlord gets attorney's fees, there is now a mirror image provision for the tenant for the same thing. This is very useful. I always look over the lease, and I always look over the lease when I get it. A lot of them have this in there. And even landlords that don't have attorneys have this in there. And they have it in there either because it's a farm lease and they figured why not. Maybe they've got it in there to be scary. Like if I win this case, you're going to be paying for my attorney, right? But whether they have an attorney or not, it reciprocates. So now I can say, because I'm an old guy and I've been practicing a long time, I can say I bill out $500 an hour, right? Now, because I mostly do pro bono work, I don't bill anything out, but that's what I could bill out, right? And so, try not to be too snarky about it, but pretty much every time I sneeze, it's going to be another $20, right? And so we can get this thing worked out, and I go home and I don't charge anything. But if we litigate this and we win, I know how to bill and I know how to collect. And so why don't we all settle down and see if we can find some middle ground there. That is a huge tool. And so always look over the lease and see if it's there. Because just because you're doing this pro bono, that's not the analytical framework for attorney's fees. The analytical framework is, what do you charge in the larger community, and is it reasonable for what you're doing right here? Okay? And so always look that over. It's an incredible negotiating tool. And if you actually end up having to litigate this, why not get reimbursed for your time?
Question.
Yes.
That type of provision when you're in-house, probably not available?
I would not make that assumption. I think if you are in-house, there are court decisions that talk about and going through a whole list of factors and figuring out if a attorney's fee claim is reasonable. I think for in-house attorneys, the analytical framework would be what would be a reasonable charge in the community. Because you run into this with legal aid attorneys all the time. Legal aid attorneys never charge their clients anything, right? But they have developed kind of schedules in consultation with the bar to say, well, what would be a reasonable attorney fee to charge for someone who's got 10 years experience who works in a firm of 50 attorneys or less, okay? And so I see that as being directly relating to in-house counsel as well. Okay. All right, so now I'm gonna go, well, let's see, where am I gonna go? I'm gonna go back to the slideshow. There we go, okay. So we spent a lot of time on the answer form because understanding kind of the context of the position of the client in terms of defenses is important to really doing everything else. Again, most of these cases are going to settle. You're in a much better kind of framework for settling if you've got defenses that you can articulate. But even if you don't have any defenses, the tenant still has some settlement room, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But the next thing I want to do is say, well, do we file an answer or not? Now, you might be thinking, well, we always got to file this answer because we've got all these boxes to check off, and we don't want Larry to feel bad that nobody ever files the answer, so we got to file the answer. No, you don't have to file the answer. The statute on evictions uses the word answer as a verb, not a noun. That's why all of us lawyers ought to be nerdy wordsmiths, right? Because that means an answer in an eviction case doesn't have to be in writing. The tenant answers the complaint at the hearing, right? So, file one or not, okay? Well, if there are only two defenses, one is service because it was service on the babysitter and habitability, I don't think I'd waste my time doing the answer. You know, you can just go and say that, the tenant could go in and say that. So I would say don't use the answer. Well, why not use the answer? Well, one, it takes time to fill it out, okay? And then two, you'd have to, if you're gonna file the answer, you have to get a fee waiver, otherwise it's gonna be $300 to file it, right? And so those are the reasons to not file an answer. The reason to file an answer would be maybe you've got 12 defenses there, and maybe just the shock value of having that document in the face of the landlord is worthwhile. So maybe do it there. I'd say I've really evolved a lot toward not filing an answer in cases, while probably 15 years ago I would have done it all the time. Okay? And it takes time. It takes time to fill out the form, but also takes time to go through the IFP. Okay? And so let's just talk a little bit about the IFP right now. So you've got in your packet an IFP affidavit. It's not the most intuitive document. And one of the things that's really problematic about it, it's pretty good at teasing out income. It's really bad at teasing out expenses. And I didn't really worry about that till about 5 years ago when I started to see some referees saying, well, just because this person only has $1,000 income, I'm not that certain they don't have $300 sitting around they could spend. Now, I always found that kind of odd that someone would maybe really have 1/3 of their monthly income available to pay for a court fee. But beyond that, I created this table at the back of this to basically break down expenses. Okay? Now, I haven't had a lot of pushback on IFPs in the last couple of years, so I'm not certain how important doing the table is. Where I do the table, if someone's got an income of like $700 a month and their rent is taking up 80% of their income, if I were pressed for time, I'm not sure I would go through the table. If their income is $2,000 a month for a family of 3, that's still a pretty low income, but I could see a judicial officer thinking, well, you know, maybe they've got some dough sitting around. So then I would do this. The nice thing about this table, I spent a lot of time working on this when I was at Legal Aid to try to be as complete as possible. You go through the table, and the table tells you where to put the numbers from the table into the affidavit form. Most of it goes into the last paragraph on the affidavit form, which is kind of like a general catch-all thing. And so what I'll usually do is I'll put in a number there, and I'll say, like I just did one of those down at court yesterday. The person had about, I don't know, what, $1,400 in take-home income, and their expenses were about $1,500 a month rough. And so what I'm saying there, so I put in is from the attached table, expenses $1,500 a month. My expenses actually exceed my income. I have no ability to pay this court fee. Okay? So that's how I use those things together. But if you're going to file any written document, the first time you file a document in a case, there will be this fee, this fairly large fee. And so the initial filing fee, and there can also be other fees attached. So like if you're doing a motion for expungement, there'd be a motion fee as well. So whenever you do the first document in a case, you got to do an IFP. So if you can avoid doing a document, then you can avoid doing the IFP, right? Now, let's say you decide you want to file something, okay? And you're down in court. But then we got to deal with filing and e-filing. As lawyers, we have to e-file. Tenants don't. So if I'm down at court and I'm drafting something, even if I'm going to represent in the court hearing and I'm going to file it, and I'm just down at court, I'm filing something for today, I draft it up, I have the client sign it, have the client walk up to the desk with the IFP, the client files at the desk, okay? And the reason I'm doing that is because if I e-file it, for those, I'm a computer savvy person, I'm all fine with computers and everything. I'm not really excited about e-filing. It goes to a server down in Texas, of course, right? And then it goes to another server back up in court, and it sits in a queue. And I'm sure there's somebody there who's minding the queue, but there's other stuff going on. I have never had a case go through e-filing and get approved in less than 2 hours. Okay. So if you e-file it, you're not going to be able to use it in 15 minutes in this court hearing. So I always have, so whenever I'm down at court, drafting stuff at court for today, I have the client do the signing, I have the client do the filing. Now, if I'm back at my office, then I e-file. Okay. Right. So I would say in most cases, you're probably not going to need to file an answer. But the answer is a great analytical tool to figure out what your issues are going to be. Okay. Removal of a judicial officer, you have the right to remove any judicial officer before they start presiding on your case at a hearing. So if you are representing someone and they're going to go into arraignment in a half an hour, if you want to remove that judicial officer, you would have to file a notice of removal. Because now the problem is that's a document. So now you're going to have an IFP for that. Now, whether to remove an officer or not is really just kind of a personal choice issue. I probably remove referees more often than others. But if you ever want to consult about that, I'd be happy to do it. I think the referees try to do a good job. I have some differences with some of them over their interpretations of certain aspects of the law. Okay. Once the party appears in front of that judicial officer, they can no longer remove that judicial officer, but they could remove a different judicial officer if another person gets assigned to their case for a trial before they appear in front of that judicial officer. Okay. Oral motions. You get to do oral motions because we've got a housing court rule that says that. So when you go into the arraignment and you've got your answer form or not, you can be in there and say, Your Honor, I'd like to move for dismissal of this action because the court papers were served on the babysitter who lives next door. And we've got the tenant here who can testify about that, okay? I get to do that because there's a housing court rule that says I get to do that. And I don't have to have given 14 days notice in advance because that would be kind of silly anyway because the case only got filed 7 days ago, okay? But there's a rule that allows me to do that, okay? Settlement. Let's talk a little bit about settlement. Settlement can be anything that's not illegal, okay? So think broadly about settlement. Let's say this is a non-payment of rent case and the tenant's now got the money and there's a habitability issue, okay? And so maybe that's what you want to raise in this case. But let's say there are other things going on, like there are privacy issues that are going on that you might not be able to litigate in this eviction case. Why not address it? Why not try to do global solutions instead of like minimal things? So when you're talking about settlement, try to figure out what your client wants and not just limited to the scope of the eviction case, because the settlement, the referee is limited to the scope of the eviction case. The settlement is not, as long as it's not illegal, okay? So what are some of the things that can come up? It'd be changes in tenant's conduct, changes in the landlord's conduct. It can be a schedule for repairs. It can be a reduction in the rent. It could be getting rid of the landlord's claim for the filing fee. It could be for expungement when we're done with the case. It could be return of the security deposit early. It could be all kinds of things. So one thing you want to do is just try to find out what does the client want, okay? And don't assume the client wants to stay, because maybe the client doesn't want to stay. Maybe this is just crap and I'm done with it, okay? But they want more time, okay? Or maybe they really want to stay, okay? So try to find out don't assume that what you think ought to happen is what they want, okay? So inquire about that. Now let's say there are no defenses at all. You've looked at all this stuff, there are no defenses at all. And it's a non-payment of rent case and the client doesn't have the money because of bad fortune and they just want time to move. And the landlord's saying, I want you to move out in a couple of days, okay? That's a bad offer, right? Because the tenant can get more than that. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. But when you're evaluating settlement offers, it's got to be in the context of what does the client want, what's a best case scenario, and what's a worst case scenario. Moving out in 2 days is not a worst case scenario, okay? Moving out in longer than 2 days is actually a worst case scenario. So why settle for something that's worse than a worst case scenario? A couple other things about settlement agreements. Legal aid's got a settlement agreement and the court has a settlement agreement. They're both in your packet. The court settlement agreement, unfortunately, I think it's a little more out of the mindset of the landlord's the customer. It's all about getting the landlord what the landlord wants. The settlement agreement from legal aid has a section in there about kind of setting things up for expungement, because expungement is something that every tenant wants once they learn that it's an option, okay? And so that settlement agreement tees up that conversation. A couple of the things about settlements that I run into often is on this slide here, that a payment schedule will include rent in the future. And that's actually outside the jurisdiction of the court, but I see it approved all the time. Saw one yesterday where a landlord was now trying to evict the tenant. There was a settlement agreement in December. The case was about December and November rent. It included a provision about when the tenant would pay January rent. Tenant was late in January rent. Landlord's down there getting a writ on a case that never involved January rent for not paying January rent. And that goes against the case law. The case law is that that's outside the scope of it. And if the tenant didn't pay the January rent, you file a case in January about the January rent. I see this all the time. So if you're in settlement agreement conversations and they want to put out a time frame for future rent payments, I would really push back on that as being outside of the scope of the court, okay? The other thing I see, and it's just something that really bugs me a lot, and I'd like to see settlement agreements deal with this, is the settlement agreements now, both the legal aid one and the court one, allows the landlord, if there's a violation of the settlement agreement, to go down and get a writ with no notice to the tenant. And I just have big due process problems with that. Believe me, tenants don't get to go down to court and say, landlord violated the settlement agreement, give me more rent abatement with no hearing for the landlord. That does not happen, okay? I don't think the converse should happen here, but it's in both of these settlement agreement forms, and it's a fairly common practice. When I do settlement agreements, I work on getting that crossed out. I think if the landlord thinks the tenant violated the settlement agreement, at a minimum, they should have to give notice to the tenant that they're now getting a writ. And so if the tenant has a dispute with that, the tenant could then file a motion and get a hearing to then adjudicate whether the tenant had actually violated. Okay. So here we are on the time here. Okay, VLN has a revolving fund that's funded by the Knight Group to help tenants pay rent into court to litigate habitability cases. Why is this a big deal? Well, it gets to another one of my grumpy issues. You might be thinking I'm a grumpy old man all the time, and Well, I guess I am, okay. My grumpiness is that when a tenant raises a habitability defense, quite often a referee or a judge will say, okay, McDonough, you withheld rent for December and January. I want you to pay that rent into court and continue to pay rent as it comes due while we litigate this. Now, the second part I think is okay. I think that's within the court's jurisdiction to say, while this case is pending, rather than pay the rent, the landlord pay it to the court. But to make me pay the back rent that is actually in dispute because of the habitability issue, I think is actually a due process violation. And there's actually a court case going up to the Court of Appeals right now on that topic. But for the time being, it's very common for a judge or referee to say, in order to litigate this thing, McDonough, you got to pay your December and January rent that you didn't pay into court. And maybe I've spent that on other things. Maybe I got heat issues and I've spent that on coats for the kids or whatever, and I don't have it all. VLN has a fund where they can kind of supplement what I've got to then meet the amount that needs to be paid into court, so that I can now have my trial on habitability. And if I get a rent abatement, I get a rent reduction from that, then the rent, what comes off the top first would go back to VLN to replenish the fund. This is a really nice thing. I mean, there have been lots of times over the years where I had to tell a client, the way the referees and judges are dealing with this right now, because you didn't hang on to all the rent, we will not get a trial on habitability here. And so we better settle this case. Now we have a little more room to not settle the case because of this fund. So this is like huge. If you have a case where you think this applies, you call up VLN, you talk to Mariah, and she can work this very quickly. Okay. Trials are usually within about a week or so, but usually the parties can agree to a later date. So have your calendar with you. I'm still surprised at this day and age that I'll have an attorney on the other side that doesn't know what they're going to be doing next week. That's great. Bring your phone. I have a phone. I have a hard copy calendar. They don't take up much space because you can control when that hearing's going to be. There's this thinking that, well, it's only going to be on this date. But the court, they're busy. And if the attorneys say, yeah, we looked at our calendars and we're good to go 2 weeks from tomorrow, the court is not going to say no. It's going to say yes. And so, if nobody says anything about when they want to have it, the court's probably going to schedule it within about a week. Okay? And it's okay for you to say, I'm out of town next week, but we can do this a week from Monday. The court's probably going to say fine. So have your calendar with you. Plaintiff has the burden of proof on this. And so if it's a 50-50, plaintiff loses. Okay? And so at the same time, I always feel like I have the burden of proving. Even though the plaintiff's got it, I don't just kind of sit back there and think, well, I don't think they met their burden, so I'm not going to put on a defense. I never do that. Now, sometimes I will do a motion for summary judgment at the end of the plaintiff's case. That's kind of like a motion for a directed verdict if you had a jury, but you usually don't have juries. You can have juries in these. I've only done 2 jury trials in this area. I've used to think that the demographics of juries probably weren't great for the demographics of my client base. I think that's actually changed a little bit, and so I might be more comfortable with juries right now. It slows it down a little bit, doesn't slow it down a lot. But I've had cases where, it's a breach of lease case and the plaintiff never introduces the lease and they rest their case. Motion for a directed verdict. They haven't proved a breach of lease. Okay. Usually it's not going to be that easy. Most of these cases are non-payment of rent. When you litigate them, it's usually going to be about issues of how much is owed, whether and habitability. Those are going to be the most common things. And in the breach of lease cases, the most common issue is really going to be, is it material or not? In the holding over cases, the most common issue is going to be, has the landlord met the burden of showing non-retaliation? That's usually what you're litigating in these things. You don't have to be a litigator to be good at this stuff. It's not like you have to know all the rules of evidence. I know the rules of evidence real well. I've taught the class. What's most common is hearsay. You know, so you do need to kind of understand what's a hearsay and what isn't. Most things that are said where someone's talking about what somebody else said who's a non-party, it's usually going to be a hearsay. There are some kind of exceptions to the exception, but those are not very common. And, you know, that's the most common kind of evidentiary issue by far in these cases is really hearsay stuff. So you don't have to be a whiz about all that stuff. But if you're analyzing a case and you think there are some evidentiary issues here, you want to talk about them, be happy to do that. I mean, sometimes foundation is a motion that I would raise, but I don't do objections just to hear myself talk. I'll only raise foundation if I know they don't have it. I mean, if their foundation is based on a hearsay statement and this person's saying, yeah, I know that he had a loud party on the 15th. Well, I know the only reason he knows about the loud party on the 15th is because the next door neighbor says something about the loud party on the 15th and the neighbor's not here. So I'd say lack of foundation. Well, what's the foundation? Well, the neighbor told me. Okay, hearsay. Okay, so those are probably the objections I use the most often. If the tenant prevails, tenant doesn't win, or the tenant wins. If the landlord prevails, the landlord can go through the writ process. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. And this gets back to a little bit about conversations about settlement. It takes a little time to work the writ process. So the writ this thing's all about, it's almost like a football game. It's like they're trying to get the writ and we're playing keep away. Okay, if they don't get the writ, the tenant wins. If they get the writ, they win. Once they get the writ, you got to do some things with it. And they got to spend some money. And so this will get us back to settlement in a second. So they got to pay. So they win this case, and the court says, okay, landlord, you win this breach of lease case. You get this writ. Now, if I've asked for a 7-day stay of the writ, the court's going to do that in most situations. Okay, so that means landlords won the case today, but they're not going to get a writ for a week. Okay, so in a week, the landlord can come and get a writ. They have to pay for that. I think it's $50, something like that. You got to pay for the writ. You got to take it to the sheriff. Sheriff is across the street over in Old City Hall. Take it to the sheriff. So let's say today I lose the case, and the court says, landlord, you can get a writ next Thursday. So landlord pays the writ, they get it next Thursday, they walk it over to the sheriff's office, they pay the sheriff to deliver it. Sheriff delivers it probably on Friday. The writ says, got to be out in 24 hours. That takes us over to Saturday, so now a week from Saturday. If I'm not out then, the landlord's got to schedule the sheriff to come out a second time and pay a deposit on that, and the sheriff's got to schedule it. That takes a few days to get that kind of time when the sheriff's free. So more likely, I'm looking at the sheriff coming out the second time closer to 2 weeks from today than today. Okay? So let's say I'm down at court and we're discussing settlement and I have no defenses at all, nothing, right? And the landlord says, move out in 2 days. Bad offer, right? Because I've got somewhere in that probably 10 to 14 day period to get myself out before the sheriff comes the second time. Nothing bad happens to me when the sheriff comes the first time other than I get scared. Right? But nothing bad happens that day and nothing bad happens today. So now a settlement offer of I pay some money and I move out in 7 days. I think that's still a bad offer, right? Because I can stay for maybe another 10 to 14 days, not pay anything, okay? Now the landlord says, well, how about if you pay $500 and you move out at the end of the month? Okay. Still think that's probably a bad offer because we're sitting on the 17th and I can probably stay most of the end of the month for free. Okay. Now they say, well, okay, how about if you pay $500 and then you move out mid-February? Okay. Now that's done better because I'm paying some money to get more time than I would have gotten if I didn't pay anything. So that's how I evaluate those things. And that tells you that the tenant has settlement power even when they have no defenses because there's some time and money involved on the landlord finishing this process off. And if the landlord doesn't hate the tenant, which in most cases they don't, and if there's some trust issues there that are actually good, if the tenant says, you know, I know that I can be out by the end of this month because I've already lined up this place, okay? And if the landlord believes that, then the landlord can save some money because they don't pay for the writ. They don't pay for the sheriff's first visit. They don't pay for the sheriff's second visit.
the tenant moves out in a kind of a thoughtful way and doesn't leave any stuff behind. Landlords actually benefited by that settlement. It's not just the tenant's benefit, the landlord's benefit. So those are the things to evaluate. So there's always something for us to do, even when there are no defenses. Now, we're not going to have a trial over no defenses, but there is lots of settlement turf out there for any kind of case, whether there are no defenses up to a whole bunch of defenses. So we have got 1 minute left, so I'm just going to walk you through the last few slides. There are motions to vacate judgments. So where this would come up is if you had, for instance, a settlement agreement and the landlord said the tenant violated, then got a writ, you want to try to stop that, you'd do a motion to vacate that judgment. Let's say you see someone who missed their court hearing, they have a default judgment against them, you want to reopen it so you can litigate that habitability issue, you'd have to do a motion to vacate a judgment to do that. Now, I wanted to spend some time talking about expungement, but I kind of ran myself too late. The slides do have kind of the parameters for expungement. Again, if you can get an expungement at the close of a trial or a part of a settlement, then you don't have to do a separate motion for expungement. But the slides do kind of walk you through kind of the different grounds for doing expungement, and we're happy to talk to you about those things as well. There also are processes for doing judge reviews of referee decisions and appeals. If you think that you have a loss and you want to look at an appeal, we can talk about that and kind of help you through that. We've got a slideshow on ethics if you want to kind of look at some ethics issues. I wouldn't really worry about that too much, except if you're looking at the issue of representing two tenants together, I would take a look at that slideshow because it talks a little bit about dealing with settlement offers when you have multiple clients. And lastly, Bill Evans.
Oh, sorry. So what I'm going to recommend is, because we're going to be videotaping this for people to view afterwards, also who want to do the eviction representation project, want to be respectful of your time. It's 11 o'clock if you need to leave. And if I could ask you to talk through the rest of your slides, we'll go ahead and videotape that. For people who do have to leave but want to contact me about scheduling a shift, I can do that now. My card is also on the table there. You could contact me. Many of you will be scheduling shifts through your firm if your firm is part of More Representation Minneapolis. But you also can contact me directly if you have any questions about any of that. So with that, we'll give people just like 2 or 3 minutes for those of you who have to leave, and then we'd be grateful.
Yeah, so I'll keep talking until nobody's here. Actually, I will end talking at some point, so you don't have to worry about kind of lifetime servitude here. But for those of you that have to go, thanks a lot for coming. And so I'm just going to finish up talking a little bit about expungement. One thing I want to mention before I do that, something that we're starting to see is there's a couple of law firms that when they are engaging attorneys for defendants or defendants in eviction cases are saying, I'm not going to talk to you unless you sign a document under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. And so all I'd say about that is if they're conditioning talking based on signing a document that you don't want to sign, don't sign the document and say, fine, I'm not talking to you then. I think the whole idea of having attorneys or tenants sign Fair Debt Collection Practices documents as a condition of settling or even discussing cases, I find it particularly annoying, but I really don't even see a good legal justification for them doing that. I think it's out of a little bit of a paranoia over getting sued over violations of the Act. Some attorneys have been sued over violations of the Act because they violated the Act. So, so feel free to talk to your client about that, and when that's presented to you, say, we'll talk to you, but we're not signing anything as a precondition to doing that.
So then that did happen to me. So then the person just decided they were going into court and going to present in front of the attorney.
Right.
I mean, present before the judge.
Right.
So in that case, should one just not go in?
No. So the question is, well, if the attorney doesn't want to talk and they want to go in, what should you do? Mm-hmm. If you want to represent, go ahead and represent. I mean, I think most judicial officers would be a little cranky with the idea that in order to even discuss settlement, an attorney or a tenant would have to sign a document saying that they're waiving claims under a statute that doesn't even apply to the case. You know, maybe a judicial officer might get cranky. Sounds like that happened in your case. There's nothing you can do about that. If the client is, you know, if the client's presented with it, ultimately the client makes a decision, am I willing to sign this thing or not? And you can advise them, you know, that if you're comfortable signing this, but as a lawyer, if they're saying you have to sign it too, that's your decision.
Right.
And you can say, no, I'm not going to sign a document that's waiving claims when we haven't even had a conversation about the case. Okay. So moving on to expungement. Expungement is a really important tool to get eviction records kind of made private when they're otherwise public. And there are a couple different bases for it. One is statutory expungement. The main thing about statutory expungement is you have to show that there was something wrong with the landlord's case. Any of the things we've talked about so far are potential wrong things with the landlord's case. Okay? But to get statutory expungement, you have to have that as one of the elements. Okay? For common law expungement, you don't. Common law expungement is just an analysis of the equities. Is expungement fair to the client relative to the public? Okay? So if you don't have any errors that the landlord's committed, then you look at common law expungement. Whenever I do statutory expungement, I do common law expungement as my fallback in case the judicial officer doesn't agree with me on landlord errors. Okay? We have an expungement form motion for doing that, but if you can get expungement as part of the settlement of your case or as part of the victory of your case, then you never have to come back and do the motion. Because to come back and do the motion later, one, the record's open all this time, and two, the motion's got to be a written document, and then you have to do an IFP for it. So if you can get the expungement by not having to file a written motion, by simply asking for it in court because you can do oral motions, and you get it wrapped up when the case is done, then you get it wrapped up earlier, you never have to come back and do it again, and you never have to do an IFP. Now, another thing that we've seen some referees doing recently is focusing on the fact that evictions that are more than a year old could have been physically destroyed under the court's file retention schedule. And even if they haven't, some referees have been saying, well, if it's old enough to be destroyed, it's old enough to be expunged. So if you're doing a case right now, you know, it's clearly not old enough, an eviction case right now. But it's pretty common when you do a search for your client's name in the court system that pulls up the case you're doing right now, pretty good chance you're going to also find the eviction from 5 years ago that they didn't even know it was on their record because they settled it and they thought it disappeared when they settled it and it didn't. Okay? So you're going to have opportunities when you're representing people in cases now to maybe look at the evictions that are sitting around from a few years ago and doing motions to expunge those. Now, those you'd have to do by written motions because those cases are closed, but I'd say very strong chance that your current client has a past eviction. Why not, if you're going to deal with this eviction, get this eviction expunged, why not do the whole thing? It's not a very time-intensive process to do that motion for expungement. They do them on monthly calendars. You'd probably have it teed up for a hearing probably a couple months from now. Once you get and if you want to know more about expungements, we've got slideshows on it, we've got forms on it. Once you get an expungement, you have to then send it to the tenant screening agencies. We've got a form letter for that as well. Now, something I've been doing with the court system over the last couple of years, I've been advocating for the court system to remove older cases from its database under the file retention schedule. And that process has already started happening for older cases. I'd say the chances of us finding a case from 2000 in the court system anymore is probably pretty low, okay? While 2 years ago, I would find that case and I have to do a motion over it. I see a time in the not too distant future where older cases are automatically going to fall out of the court system. And because of some court rules where I advocated a couple of years ago, they'll start falling out of the tenant screening agency systems as well without us having to do motions for expungement. That's a work in progress. We're not there yet. So judge review and appeal. If you want to do a judge review of a referee decision, you have to file that within generally within 10 days of an oral decision or within 13 days of mailing, but it's kind of rare that you get decisions by mailing anymore. You usually get them by e-service. So I always consider the deadline to be 10 days. It's much simpler than going to the Court of Appeals. I've got a 2-page form for doing it. If you think the referee got anything wrong, there really isn't anything to lose by doing a request for judge review. It doesn't take up a lot of your time. It's a fairly quick process. It's probably done in a month or two. It involves filing a document and having a hearing. I would really strongly encourage you to do a judge review of any referee decision that you think is erroneous. Okay? I'd be happy to talk to you about that if you think you've got a case that's kind of ripe for that. And that would include even, let's say you do a motion to vacate a default judgment, and the referee says no, and you think the referee erred in denying that motion. If you went to the Court of Appeals, the Court of Appeals would probably say that's well within the discretion of the judicial officer. We're not going to do anything with it. I've had decent luck with judges saying, well, I'm going to look at it a little more closely, and I think this tenant should have had a shot, so I am going to do that. So really, any decision that you think is erroneous, I would give strong thought to doing a request for judge review on it. Going to the Court of Appeals, you can go directly from a referee to the Court of Appeals. I don't really see a reason to not do judge review first. If you're unhappy with a decision from judge review and you want to go to the Court of Appeals, you'd really be analyzing it like any other appeal. You know, did the judge abuse his or her discretion? Are there clear errors of law? I'd be happy to discuss that with you as well. For any of you that have done appellate practice, you know, it's a little more involved than just doing a judge review request. The time frame is a little fast, though. It's 15 days to go to the Court of Appeals. Rather, that's one of the faster time frames for perfecting an appeal. And talked a little bit about ethics. I've got, my manual talks about other types of cases as well. So if you ever are working with a tenant, let's say you get an eviction case settled for non-payment of rent, and the landlord's supposed to do some repair problems, or maybe you don't address the repairs because you just want to get the case settled now, and now the tenant wants to know what their remedies are for maybe getting the repairs done. You could just settle the eviction case, get that done, and then look at filing a rent escrow case or tenant remedies case. My manual discusses how to do those types of cases. So if you're ever looking at a case where the tenant wants to be in the driver's seat, either to get repairs, to deal with privacy issues, deal with lockout issues, things like that, we've got forms for all those kinds of cases, and I've got sections in my manual that tell you how to do them. And Bill Evans. So that's it. So if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. If you've got my cell phone number, if you ever want to discuss stuff with me. Steve is also a great resource over at VLN. Between us, and for those of you that are in larger firms that have done this kind of work, you may even have your own inside veterans. So feel free to reach out to them as well. There's a really nice community of folks out there to do this stuff. You are not alone when you do this. All right, thank you.